Welcome to True Crime Headquarters. Tonight, we explore for unsettling stories shaped by hidden lives and quiet deception. Settle in. Breathe slowly. Let the noise of the day fall away. Some people wear masks for so long, they forget who they were beneath them. This is the story of the architecture of destruction. The Andrew Cunanan story. Now let's begin. Andrew Cunanan understood this better than most. In the affluent neighborhoods of San Diego where he grew up in the 1980s, he perfected the art of becoming whoever the moment required. To the wealthy patrons at gallery openings, he was the worldly sophisticate who spoke 7 languages. To the students at the exclusive Bishop School, he was the charming prodigy destined for greatness. His classmates voted him most likely to be remembered, a prophecy that would fulfill itself in the most terrible way imaginable. But beneath the polished surface, something else was taking shape, something hungry and hollow. Andrew Philip Cunanan entered the world on August 31st, 1969, in National City, California, the youngest of 4 children. His father, Modesto, had served as a Navy Chief Petty Officer during Vietnam before becoming a stockbroker. His mother, Mary Ann, was a deeply religious Italian-American woman who wanted nothing more than a peaceful home. They gave Andrew everything they could scrape together: the master bedroom in their house, a sports car, admission to private schools that cost more than they could truly afford. The household, however, was anything but peaceful. Modesto accused Mary Ann of infidelities that never existed. The arguments echoed through the walls. Mary Ann suffered from depression so severe she required treatment during Andrew's formative years. Young Andrew would retreat to his room during these storms, creating elaborate fantasies about his family's wealth and status. In these stories, his father wasn't a struggling stockbroker, but a pineapple plantation owner. They weren't middle class, but genuinely wealthy, connected to the highest echelons of society. His teachers noticed his exceptional intelligence. Tests measured his IQ at 147. He could memorize entire television episodes and recite them word for word. But they also noticed something else, an unsettling tendency toward elaborate fabrications. Andrew didn't just lie about small things. He constructed entire alternate realities, stories so intricate and detailed that they almost demanded belief. When friends visited his modest home, he would explain away its ordinariness with yet another story. At Bishop School, surrounded by genuinely wealthy classmates, the gap between Andrew's reality and his fantasies grew wider. He was openly gay in an era when such openness came with significant social risk. Yet he navigated this world with remarkable skill, his intelligence and charm making him popular despite, or perhaps because of, his difference. At 15, he began frequenting gay bars, sometimes in disguise to hide his age. It was there he discovered his real talent, becoming exactly what older, wealthy men wanted him to be. These relationships weren't about romance. They were transactions. The men gave him money, gifts, access to elite social circles. He gave them companionship, discretion, the fantasy of a brilliant young man who found them fascinating. A $30,000 car appeared one day, a gift from a patron. Andrew told his friends he'd bought it himself. Then, in 1988, when Andrew was 19, everything collapsed. Modesto Cunanan was caught embezzling over $100,000 from his stockbroking firm. Rather than face arrest, he liquidated what assets the family had left and fled to the Philippines, leaving Mary and the children with almost nothing. The comfortable facade shattered overnight. They moved to a less affluent neighborhood. The master bedroom, the sports car, the private school tuition, all of it became impossible to maintain. Andrew's mother, already fragile from years of verbal abuse and depression, learned around this time that her son was gay. The revelation, combined with the family's sudden poverty and her husband's abandonment, proved too much. During an argument, Andrew physically attacked her, throwing her against a wall and dislocating her shoulder. The violence shocked even him. This was new, a glimpse of something darker than lies, more dangerous than manipulation. He dropped out of the University of California, San Diego, where he'd been studying American history, and traveled to the Philippines to find his father. What he discovered there horrified him. Modesto was living in squalor, all his grand dreams reduced to poverty in a foreign country. According to some accounts, Andrew worked as a prostitute in Manila to earn enough money for his return fare to the United States. Back in California, Andrew moved to San Francisco's Castro district, the heart of gay culture in America. There, he resumed his pattern of attaching himself to wealthy older men. But something had changed. The rejection by his father, the violence against his mother, the growing gap between his fabricated life and his actual circumstances, these pressures were building. Friends noticed dark moods, sudden flashes of anger. He began creating violent adult content, exploring increasingly extreme fantasies. By his mid-20s, Andrew Cunanan had refined his performance to an art form. He knew wines, fashion, culture. He could discuss literature and opera with ease. He had an astonishing memory for social details, names, connections, preferences. To the men who kept him, he was delightful company. But to those who knew him well, he was becoming unpredictable. His drug use increased. Cocaine, marijuana, prescription opioids. He was dealing drugs as well as using them. In 1995, he met Norman Blatchford, a wealthy older man, and began an extended relationship with him. Andrew called himself Andrew De Silva, claiming to be the son of a pineapple plantation owner from the Philippines. Blatchford gave him a car, credit cards, access to a luxurious lifestyle. They traveled to Europe together. Andrew lived in Blatchford's mansions. It was everything he'd always claimed to have. But in 1996, Blatchford tracked Andrew's spending and discovered the truth. There was no plantation. There was no De Silva family. Andrew wasn't who he claimed to be at all. The relationship ended. The money stopped. The access to luxury evaporated. Andrew was 27 years old. He'd been living on charm and deception for a decade. Now his looks were beginning to fade. A devastating loss for someone whose appearance had been his primary currency. His patrons were moving on to younger men. His drug use was becoming more obvious. The credit cards were maxed out. The invitations to exclusive parties were drying up. He spent time with two men from his past during this period. Jeffrey Trail, whom he'd met in San Diego in 1991, had been more than a friend. Andrew considered him my brother, his best friend. David Madsen, an architect, had been a romantic partner, though that relationship had ended in early 1996. Both men had moved on with their lives. Both had distanced themselves from Andrew. Both sensed something troubling in him, something they couldn't quite name but instinctively avoided. In April 1997, Andrew told friends he was moving to San Francisco. Instead, he begged his credit card company to extend his limit and bought a one-way ticket to Minneapolis. Trail had recently moved there for work. Madsen lived there too. Andrew told acquaintances he was going to take care of some business. Trail didn't want him to come. He'd told his sister as much. A week before, he'd confided in a friend about a falling out with Andrew. "I've made a lot of enemies this weekend," Trail said. "I've got to get out of here. They're going to kill me." The words were prophetic. Andrew attended a going-away party on April 24th in San Diego. For once, his friends noticed he didn't pick up the check. He couldn't. Both credit cards were at their limits. He was running out of options, running out of money, running out of the only life he'd ever known how to live. On April 25th, 1997, Andrew Cunanan boarded a plane to Minneapolis. What happened in the next 3 months would shock a nation, launch one of the largest manhunts in American history, and end with the death of one of the most famous men in the world. But it began simply, quietly, with a 27-year-old man whose entire life had been a performance, boarding a plane with a one-way ticket and a darkness in his heart that no one, perhaps not even Andrew himself, fully understood. The careful construction of Andrew Cunanan was complete. What came next was its destruction, and the destruction of everyone who stood in its path. There are moments in life when everything changes, when the trajectory of a single decision sends ripples through the world that can never be called back. For Andrew Cunanan, That moment came on the evening of April 27, 1997, in a Minneapolis loft apartment. The silence afterward must have been profound. Andrew had arrived in Minneapolis 2 days earlier and was staying at David Madsen's apartment. The 33-year-old architect had reluctantly agreed to let his former lover stay with him, though friends later said he seemed uncomfortable about the arrangement. Andrew had told him it would be temporary, just until he sorted out his plans. But Andrew's plans were becoming increasingly unclear, even to himself. On April 27th, Andrew called Jeffrey Trail from Madsen's apartment and asked him to come over. Trail, 28 years old, had moved to Minneapolis from San Diego to work for a gas company. He was a Navy veteran who had served in the Gulf War, a man known for his integrity and directness. He had distanced himself from Andrew over the previous months, sensing something unsettling in his old friend's increasing desperation. The details of what happened inside that apartment that evening remain known only through forensic evidence. No witnesses survived to tell the story. What investigators discovered later suggested an argument, a confrontation that spiraled beyond words into violence. At some point during the evening, Andrew picked up a claw hammer. Trail's body was found 2 days later by one of Madsen's co-workers, who had become concerned when David didn't show up for work. The corpse was rolled in a rug and hidden behind a sofa. Trail had been beaten with tremendous force, struck repeatedly with the hammer. His watch had stopped at 9:55 p.m., likely marking the moment of his final breath. The brutality suggested rage, not calculation. This wasn't a clean elimination but a frenzy, an explosion of violence that spoke to something broken inside the perpetrator. Andrew had stolen Trail's gun, a .40 caliber Taurus semi-automatic pistol, along with a case of hollow point bullets. For 2 days after the killing, Andrew and David Madsen remained in the apartment with Trail's body decomposing behind the sofa. Neighbors saw them together in the elevator. One witness saw them walking Madsen's dog as if nothing unusual had happened. The psychological pressure of those 48 hours is almost unimaginable. The corpse in the room, the pretense of normalcy, the knowledge that everything had irrevocably changed. What conversations passed between them during those strange, suspended days? Did Madsen believe Andrew's explanations? Was he afraid? Was he complicit? These questions haunted investigators later. On April 29th, they left together in Madsen's red Jeep Cherokee, heading north out of Minneapolis. Whether Madsen went willingly or as a hostage remains disputed. His family insisted he was being held against his will. Others noted that he had opportunities to escape during the 48 hours they remained in the apartment but didn't take them. On May 3rd, a Saturday morning, a fisherman discovered Madsen's body near East Rush Lake in Chisago County, Minnesota, about 50 miles north of Minneapolis. He had been shot 3 times, once in the back and twice in the head with Trail's stolen gun. His body lay in tall grass near the shore, already attracting insects in the spring warmth. The execution-style nature of the shooting suggested a different kind of violence than Trail's murder. This was controlled, deliberate. Andrew had taken Madsen to an isolated location and ended his life with clinical precision. Whatever had existed between them, friendship, romance, shared history, had been erased with 3 pulls of a trigger. Andrew took Madsen's Jeep and drove south toward Chicago. He now had transportation, a weapon, ammunition, and nothing left to lose. The mask he'd worn his entire adult life had finally shattered. There was no going back to the world of gallery openings and wealthy patrons. No more pretending to be Andrew De Silva or whoever else the situation required. He had killed 2 people who knew him, people from his real life. The performance was over. What remained was something rawer, more primal. Lee Miglin never saw him coming. The 72-year-old real estate developer was one of Chicago's most respected business figures. He had built his career from nothing, starting as a door-to-door silverware salesman and rising to develop some of the city's most prominent office buildings. He was married to Marilyn Miglin, owner of a successful cosmetics company and a regular presence on the Home Shopping Network. They lived in a Gold Coast mansion on East Scott Street, in one of Chicago's most exclusive neighborhoods. On the evening of May 3rd, the same day Madsen's body was discovered in Minnesota. Marilyn Miglin was traveling for business. Lee was alone in the house. The details of what happened when Andrew encountered Lee Miglin remain disputed. Investigators found no evidence that the two men knew each other, though rumors persisted. The FBI investigated claims of a prior connection but couldn't establish any link. Miglin's family has always maintained it was a random crime of opportunity, that Andrew simply chose their house and their father was in the wrong place at the wrong time. What isn't disputed is what Andrew did to him. Lee Miglin was found in his garage on the morning of May 4th by his wife, who had returned home to find the front gate unlocked, unusual for her meticulous husband. He had failed to pick her up from the airport as planned. The house seemed disturbed. Dirty dishes in the sink, stubble in the bathroom sink, a handgun in the bathroom. In the garage, she found her husband. He had been bound at the wrists with his hands behind his back. His feet were wrapped in duct tape. His head was completely covered in duct tape except for a small breathing hole beneath his nostrils, making him look, according to witnesses, like a mummy. His ribs were broken. He had been stabbed more than 20 times with a screwdriver. He had been beaten. And finally, his throat had been cut with a garden bow saw. The level of torture was shocking even to experienced homicide detectives. This wasn't just murder. It was prolonged, deliberate infliction of suffering. Cook County prosecutors later stated that Miglin was killed by bounding him, beating him, stabbing him, and slashing his throat. Former Assistant State's Attorney Robert Milan called it a savage murder and described Andrew as an absolutely evil guy who was out of control. After killing Miglin, Andrew didn't immediately flee. He went into the house. He made himself a ham sandwich and left the sliced ham on Miglin's desk. He shaved in the bathroom. He showered. He took his time in the home of the man he'd just tortured to death, as if the house were his own. Then he took Miglin's dark green Lexus sedan and drove away, leaving Madsen's Jeep parked near the house with Minnesota plates still attached, the vehicle that would ultimately link him to the crime. Inside the Lexus was a car phone, a technology still relatively new in 1997. Andrew apparently didn't realize or didn't care that the phone's activation could be tracked. Chicago police discovered the Jeep only because an officer noticed it had accumulated multiple parking tickets and decided to run the plates. The vehicle had been sitting there for days. When the plates came back registered to David Madsen of Minnesota, and Minnesota authorities were searching for Madsen in connection with Jeffrey Trail's murder, the pieces began connecting. For investigators, a pattern was emerging. 3 men were dead in a week. The killer was moving across the country, taking vehicles from his victims, leaving a trail of unimaginable violence. And he was accelerating. The gap between murders was shrinking. On May 4th, authorities in 3 states, Minnesota, Illinois, and soon New Jersey, were hunting for the same man. Andrew Cannan's face was appearing on news broadcasts. The FBI was mobilizing resources across multiple field offices. Law enforcement was attempting to reconstruct his movements, interview his known associates, predict where he might go next. But Andrew was already ahead of them, driving east through Pennsylvania in Lee Miglin's Lexus, the car phone periodically pinging off cell towers as he made calls, unaware or uncaring that each activation was creating a digital trail. On May 8th, the phone activated in Philadelphia. The media, following standard procedure, reported that authorities had tracked him to Philadelphia. Andrew heard the news. He ripped the phone out of the car. The tracking stopped. He could have been anywhere. On May 9th, a Friday evening, William Reese didn't come home for dinner. His wife grew concerned and drove to Finns Point National Cemetery in Pennsville Township, New Jersey, where William worked as the caretaker. She found the office door ajar, the radio playing inside, but her husband nowhere to be seen. Police arrived and found 45-year-old William Reese shot in the head with the same Taurus pistol Andrew had stolen from Jeffrey Trail. Unlike Andrew's other victims, Reese had no connection to him whatsoever. He wasn't a former lover or friend. He wasn't part of Andrew's past. He was simply in possession of something Andrew wanted: a red 1995 Chevrolet pickup truck. This was pure practicality. Andrew needed a new vehicle because Miglin's Lexus was too conspicuous. William Reese died for his truck. The randomness of this killing changed everything for law enforcement. If Andrew would kill a complete stranger for a vehicle, then no one was safe. There was no predicting his movements based on past relationships or known connections. He could strike anywhere, anyone. The FBI placed Andrew Cunanan on the 10 most wanted fugitives list on June 12, 1997. He was the 449th addition to the list and the first person from San Diego ever added. His face appeared on America's Most Wanted. Rewards were offered. Gay community organizations posted warnings, concerned that Andrew might infiltrate their circles as he had done his entire adult life. But Andrew had vanished. The red Chevrolet truck should have been easy to spot, yet no one found it. Days turned into weeks. The massive manhunt, involving field offices across the country, cooperation between multiple state and local jurisdictions, constant media attention, produced no results. What no one knew was that Andrew had driven south, not north or west as many expected. He had driven all the way to Florida, and in Miami Beach, he had found a cheap hotel where he could pay cash and ask no questions. The Normandy Plaza Hotel charged $29 a night. For 2 months, Andrew Cunanan hid in plain sight, an invisible man in a tourist town. The investigation continued to analyze his past, his psychology, his potential motivations. Some theorized he was HIV positive and seeking revenge. An autopsy would later prove this false. Others suggested he was eliminating ex-lovers. But half his victims had no romantic connection to him at all. The truth was simpler and more terrifying. Andrew Cunanan had spent his entire life constructing an elaborate fiction about who he was. When that fiction collapsed, when the performance could no longer be sustained, what remained was something broken and dangerous. A man who had lived so long as a reflection of others' desires that he had no authentic self underneath. The mask had broken, and what emerged was capable of anything. In Miami, Andrew was watching the news, seeing his face, reading about himself. He pawned a gold coin he'd stolen from Lee Miglin, signing his own name despite knowing police routinely checked pawn records. It was almost as if he wanted to be caught, or perhaps had stopped caring about being caught. He was running out of money. On July 14th, he checked out of the Normandy Plaza without paying for his final night. He had nowhere to go, no plan, no resources, but he was still free. And in South Beach, just a few blocks from his cheap hotel, lived one of the most famous men in the world. Andrew Cunanan had always wanted to be remembered. He was about to ensure that he would be in the worst way possible. Some mornings begin like any other, with routines so familiar they require no thought. Coffee at the same cafe, the same walk, the same newspaper. These small rituals provide comfort, a sense of order in an unpredictable world. But sometimes, in these moments of routine, the unpredictable finds us anyway. July 15, 1997, dawned clear and bright over Miami Beach. The Atlantic stretched away to the horizon, that particular shade of turquoise that had drawn people to this barrier island for generations. By 8:30 a.m., the temperature was already climbing into the 80s, promising another scorching summer day. The streets of South Beach, with their Art Deco buildings painted in pastels, their sidewalk cafes, their beautiful people, were beginning to wake up. At Casa Casuarina, the 3-story mansion at 1116 Ocean Drive, Gianni Versace was preparing for his morning routine. The 50-year-old fashion designer had made this palatial residence his American home, a Mediterranean-style villa he'd purchased in 1992 and lovingly restored. The house had been built in 1930 by Alden Freeman, heir to an oil fortune, and was inspired by Christopher Columbus's house in Santo Domingo. Versace had transformed it into a masterpiece, adding mosaics, frescoes, a swimming pool lined with thousands of tiles he'd imported from Italy. The designer had spent the previous evening at dinner with friends, discussing plans for the future. There was a tennis match scheduled for later that morning with his friend Lazzaro Quintana. But first, as was his custom, he wanted to pick up a few magazines from the News Cafe, a popular spot along Ocean Drive known for its extensive collection of international periodicals. Normally, Versace's assistant Antonio D'Amico would make this errand. But that morning, for reasons no one would ever fully understand, Versace decided to go himself. Perhaps it was the beautiful weather. Perhaps he wanted the exercise. Perhaps it was simply a whim, one of those small decisions we make without thinking about their consequences. He left Casa Casuarina around 8:30 a.m., walking the short distance to the cafe. Witnesses later recalled seeing him, tan, fit, wearing shorts and a distinctive shirt, moving with the easy confidence of someone completely at home in his surroundings. He purchased several magazines, including Vogue and Entertainment Weekly, paid cash, and began the walk back home. At approximately 8:45 a.m., Gianni Versace reached the front steps of Casa Casuarina. He was climbing the stairs, his magazines in hand, his house keys ready. The morning was proceeding exactly as 100 other mornings had proceeded. That's when Andrew Cunanan stepped out of the shadows. The gunshots, two of them, fired in rapid succession, shattered the quiet morning. Both bullets struck Versace in the back of the head at point-blank range. He collapsed on the steps, the magazines scattering. Blood began pooling on the pale stone. A witness, a man who had been unloading magazines from a truck nearby, saw the shooter flee. He tried to follow but lost him in the crowd. Andrew ran toward a parking garage where William Reese's stolen red pickup truck sat, the vehicle he'd been using for 2 months, while Miami Beach police inexplicably failed to locate it despite knowing he was in the area. Inside Casa Casuarina, Antonio D'Amico heard the shots. He ran outside to find the man he loved dying on the steps of their home. The paramedics arrived within minutes, but there was nothing to be done. Gianni Versace was pronounced dead at Jackson Memorial Hospital at 9:15 a.m. The news spread with the speed of modern media. By midday, every major outlet in the world was reporting the assassination. The fashion world was stunned. Celebrities who had worn Versace's designs, who had considered him a friend, expressed their shock and grief. Princess Diana, Elton John, Madonna all mourned publicly. But beyond the celebrity headlines, there was a darker question. Why? Miami Beach homicide detectives immediately began processing the scene. They found the red pickup truck in a parking garage just blocks away. Inside the vehicle were newspapers with articles about Andrew Cunanan, clippings about his previous murders. It was almost as if he'd been constructing a scrapbook of his crimes. The investigation revealed that Andrew had been in Miami Beach for 2 months, staying at the Normandy Plaza Hotel under his own name. He had been 3 minutes away from being apprehended days before the murder. A sandwich shop employee had recognized him from America's Most Wanted and called police. But by the time officers arrived, Andrew had left. The near miss haunted investigators afterward. 3 minutes. That's how close they'd come to preventing Versace's death. Questions emerged about the extent of Andrew's previous connection to Versace. Some claimed they had met briefly in San Francisco in October 1990, when Versace was in town for the San Francisco Opera and Andrew was still young and attractive, before the drugs and desperation had marked him. One acquaintance recalled Andrew gushing about meeting the designer, about Versace recognizing him and saying, "Lego di Como, no?" suggesting they might have encountered each other at Versace's Lake Como estate. But these stories were impossible to verify. Versace attended thousands of events and met tens of thousands of people. Whether he actually remembered Andrew from a brief encounter 7 years earlier, or whether Andrew had simply inserted himself into the designer's orbit for a moment, remained unclear. What was clear was Andrew's fascination with Versace. The designer represented everything Andrew had always wanted to be. Genuinely wealthy, genuinely famous, genuinely respected in elite circles. The FBI believed a meeting between them was likely, but the extent of any relationship was never established. Some speculated that Andrew killed Versace out of rejection or perceived slights. Others suggested it was simply about notoriety, that Andrew knew killing someone as famous as Versace would make him infamous, which was the next best thing to being famous. For the gay community in Miami Beach and beyond, Versace's murder carried particular weight. He was one of the most prominent openly gay men in the world, a figure who had helped normalize and glamorize gay identity at a time when AIDS was still devastating the community. His death at the hands of another gay man felt like a betrayal, a wound that cut deeper than just the loss of a talented designer. Some community members criticized law enforcement for what they perceived as an inadequate response to Andrew's presence in Miami Beach. Despite being on the FBI's most wanted list, despite his face being plastered on television and in newspapers, Andrew had managed to live openly in South Beach for 2 months. He'd used his real name to pawn stolen goods. He'd been spotted and reported days before the murder. Yet he remained free. Was it homophobia? Was it incompetence? Was it simply the difficulty of finding one man in a tourist destination where thousands of visitors came and went every day? The answer was probably all of these factors combined, but the question remained painful for a community that felt it wasn't taken seriously enough. After killing Versace, Andrew vanished again. The Miami Beach Police Department, the FBI, the U.S. Marshals all intensified their search. Roadblocks were set up. The airport was monitored. Every tip was investigated. But Andrew seemed to have dematerialized. The public response was intense. Versace's funeral in Milan drew thousands of mourners and was broadcast internationally. Princess Diana, who had been photographed with Versace just weeks before, was among those devastated by his death. The designer's sister Donatella, who would take over the Versace empire, was photographed in sunglasses, her face a mask of grief. Meanwhile, in Miami Beach, fear permeated the community. A serial killer who had already murdered 5 people was still at large. Could he strike again? Was anyone safe? Parents kept their children home. Businesses closed early. The usual carefree atmosphere of South Beach was replaced by a tense vigilance. Rewards were offered. Tips flooded in from people who thought they'd seen Andrew. Most led nowhere. Days passed. Then a week. The massive manhunt, one of the largest in American history, seemed to be failing. 8 days after Versace's murder, on July 23rd, a man named Fernando Carrera was doing his rounds as a caretaker for several houseboats in Miami Beach's Indian Creek area, about 2.5 miles from Casa Casuarina. One of the houseboats, a 2-story structure called the Miramar, was supposed to be empty. But as Carrera approached, he noticed the door was slightly ajar. He entered cautiously and immediately sensed something was wrong. There was evidence someone had been living there, clothes, food wrappers. As he moved deeper into the houseboat, he heard a sudden sound from upstairs. A gunshot. Carrera fled immediately and called police. Within minutes, the area was surrounded. SWAT teams took positions around the houseboat. Negotiators attempted to make contact with whoever was inside. There was no response. The standoff lasted 5 hours. Authorities tried everything, calling out on bullhorns, using phones, attempting to see inside the windows. Still no response. As evening approached, they decided they had to enter. The SWAT team stormed the houseboat, moving room by room in careful formation. In the upstairs bedroom, they found Andrew Cunanan's body. He had shot himself in the head with Trail's stolen gun, the same weapon he'd used to kill Madsen, Reese, and Versace. He had been dead since shortly after Carrera arrived. The 5-hour standoff had been with a corpse. In death, Andrew looked smaller than he had in his wanted posters. The body was taken to the medical examiner's office, where an autopsy confirmed what many had suspected. Andrew was HIV negative. The theory that he'd been seeking revenge for an infection was false. Whatever had motivated his killing spree, it wasn't that. There was no suicide note, no explanation, no confession or justification. Andrew Cunanan had taken his reasons to the grave. The media coverage was overwhelming. Every detail of the houseboat, the body, the investigation was reported and analyzed. Experts offered theories about Andrew's psychology, his motivations, his trajectory from charming socialite to serial killer. But theories weren't answers. For the families of his victims, Jeffrey Trail's family in San Diego, David Madsen's family in Minnesota, Lee Miglin's widow Marilyn and son Duke in Chicago, William Reese's wife in New Jersey, and Versace's partner and family around the world, Andrew's death brought no real closure. The The man who had destroyed their lives with such casual cruelty had escaped justice by his own hand. Duke Miglin would later say, "We are never going to know because the two people involved are dead." There's never really closure in a situation like this. The morning of July 23, 1997, the world stopped holding its breath. The manhunt was over. The killer was dead. But the questions remained, unanswered and unanswerable, hanging in the air like smoke that would never quite clear. In the end, we are left with fragments. Crime scene photographs, witness statements, an empty houseboat, a stolen gun, 5 bodies, and questions that circle endlessly, like birds searching for a place to land. Why did Andrew Cunanan kill 5 people in the spring and summer of 1997? The simple truth is that no one knows. Perhaps not even Andrew himself fully understood what drove him to murder. But in examining the wreckage of his life and the lives he destroyed, certain patterns emerge. Not answers, exactly, but shadows of answers, glimpses of the architecture that supported his descent into violence. Andrew Cunanan was 27 years old when he boarded that plane to Minneapolis on April 25, 1997. He had been living a particular kind of life for a decade, one built entirely on performance, on becoming whoever he needed to be to extract resources from wealthy older men. He spoke 7 languages. He knew wines and art. He could discuss opera and literature with ease. He was intelligent, charming, and utterly hollow at his core. The psychologist Paul Ekman, who studied deception, once wrote that the best liars are those who have no authentic self to contradict their lies. Andrew had spent so long performing different versions of himself that there was nothing solid underneath. He was a mirror, reflecting back whatever his patrons wanted to see. And mirrors, when they crack, reveal nothing but empty space behind the glass. By early 1997, that mirror was shattering. At 27, Andrew was aging out of the world he'd inhabited. Gay culture in the 1990s, particularly in the wealthy circles Andrew moved through, placed tremendous emphasis on youth and physical beauty. Andrew's looks, which had been his primary asset, were beginning to fade. His drug use was becoming more obvious. His lies were catching up with him. Norman Blatchford had discovered the truth and ended their relationship. The money stopped. The invitations dried up. The lifestyle Andrew had maintained for a decade was collapsing. Dr. Park Dietz, a forensic psychiatrist who studied the case, suggested that Andrew might have been experiencing what's called a narcissistic collapse, a psychological crisis that occurs when someone with narcissistic personality disorder can no longer maintain their grandiose self-image. The person they pretended to be, the person they convinced the world they were, gets stripped away. What remains is intolerable. Some people respond to such a crisis with depression or substance abuse. Some seek therapy or attempt to rebuild. But in rare cases, the response is violence. Rage turned outward, a desire to destroy the world that no longer reflects back the image they want to see. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit created a profile of Andrew after his death. They noted several key factors: his history of pathological lying, his complete lack of authentic relationships, his parasitic lifestyle, his increasing drug use, his inability to maintain employment or sustain himself independently. They noted his superficial charm, something common in people with antisocial personality disorder, and his complete lack of remorse or empathy. But profiles don't fully explain why someone commits murder. They describe risk factors, not inevitabilities. Plenty of people share Andrew's psychological characteristics without ever killing anyone. The specific trigger appears to have been rejection by the people who knew him best. Jeffrey Trail had distanced himself from Andrew, sensing something dangerous in his desperation. David Matson had ended their romantic relationship, though they'd maintained some contact. Both men had moved on with their lives, leaving Andrew behind. For someone who had spent his entire adult life constructing elaborate fictions about his importance and status, being abandoned by people who knew the truth, who had seen behind the performance, may have been intolerable. They were witnesses to his inauthenticity, reminders of his actual self versus the self he projected. The violence against Trail was personal and rage-filled, suggesting uncontrolled emotion. The execution of Madsen was colder, more calculated. It's possible Andrew initially tried to maintain some kind of relationship with Madsen, that they spent those 2 days together in the apartment because Andrew was attempting to manipulate him into silence or continued affection. When that failed, when Madsen couldn't or wouldn't play along, Andrew killed him too. Then came Lee Miglin. The brutality inflicted on the 72-year-old real estate developer remains the most disturbing aspect of the entire case. Trail's murder was impulsive. Madsen's was practical. Reese's was purely transactional. But Miglin was tortured extensively before being killed. Why? The FBI investigated whether Andrew and Miglin had a prior relationship, perhaps a client relationship. Given Andrew's history as an escort, no evidence was ever found. Miglin's family has always insisted they were strangers. But former FBI agent Greg McCrary argues that the level of personal violence suggests some kind of connection, even if it was brief. People don't typically torture strangers for hours without some emotional investment in the act. One theory is that Miglin represented everything Andrew had always wanted to be but never could achieve authentically. A self-made man who had built genuine wealth and respect through hard work, who had a real family and a real legacy. Perhaps in Miglin, Andrew saw a mirror image of the lies he'd told about himself, except Miglin's version was real. That contrast, for someone in the midst of psychological collapse, might have been enough to trigger rage. Or perhaps it was simpler. Perhaps Andrew was already so far into his spree, so detached from ordinary human empathy, that torturing Miglin was simply something he did because he could, because there were no consequences in the moment, because the mask was completely gone and what remained was capable of anything. The murder of William Reese was different in character. Quick, efficient, purely practical. Andrew needed a vehicle. Reese had one. The fact that Reese was a husband, a father, a man with a life and family, none of that mattered. He was reduced to an obstacle between Andrew and what Andrew wanted. This is perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire case. The speed with which Andrew moved from emotional murders of people he knew to the cold execution of a complete stranger. The psychological distance between those acts is vast, yet Andrew crossed it in days. And then came Versace. The designer's murder stands apart from the others in important ways. It was targeted, planned. Andrew had been in Miami Beach for 2 months. He'd had time to locate Versace's home, to observe his routines. The shooting was quick and efficient, suggesting Andrew had thought through exactly how to execute it. But why Versace specifically? The most commonly accepted theory is that Andrew wanted notoriety. He had spent his life trying to be important, to be recognized, to matter in elite circles. He had failed at this through legitimate means, but he could achieve it through infamy. By killing one of the most famous men in the world, Andrew ensured he would be remembered. His high school classmates had voted him most likely to be remembered. He was making that prophecy come true, albeit in the most twisted way imaginable. There's a certain logic to this that fits Andrew's psychology. If he couldn't be famous, he could be infamous. If he couldn't be admired, he could be feared. If his performance of success had failed, he could at least guarantee that people would remember his name. The fact that he killed himself 8 days later, rather than trying to escape or kill again, supports this theory. He had achieved his goal. The whole world knew his name. There was nothing left to accomplish. Suicide was the final act of the performance, the closing of the curtain. But there may have been other motivations mixed in as well. Versace represented the pinnacle of gay success and acceptance in the mainstream world. He had achieved everything Andrew had wanted: wealth, fame, respect, a place in elite society. And he had done it authentically, through talent and hard work. Perhaps Andrew's rage at his own failures extended to someone who had succeeded where he had failed. Or perhaps, after killing 4 people, after crossing every moral boundary that most humans never cross, killing a 5th wasn't really a decision at all. Perhaps by that point, Andrew was operating on pure momentum, his actions divorced from rational motivation. In the aftermath, investigators combed through Andrew's past looking for warning signs, trying to understand how someone could go from charming socialite to serial killer. They found plenty of red flags: the pathological lying, the violent pornography he'd created, the physical abuse of his mother, the increasing drug use, the fits of rage that friends had noticed. But they also found something else. Andrew's entire life had been a slow-motion disintegration, a performance that became harder to maintain until it finally collapsed entirely. There was no single moment when he became a killer. There was instead a gradual erosion of whatever moral structures might have restrained him, combined with a life built on such complete inauthenticity that there was no stable self to return to when the performance failed. For the families of his victims, this psychological analysis provides little comfort. Duke Miglin, Lee's son, has spoken about the impossibility of closure when the killer takes all explanations to the grave. Marilyn Miglin, Lee's widow, chose to focus on preserving her husband's legacy and continuing her work, refusing to let Andrew's violence define the rest of her life. Antonio D'Amico, Versace's partner, has maintained a dignified silence about the loss he witnessed on his doorstep. These survivors and the families of Jeffrey Trail, David Madsen, and William Reese have had to live with not just grief but confusion. Why their loved ones? What did they do to deserve such violence? The answer, of course, is nothing. They were in the wrong place at the wrong time, or they happened to know someone whose internal architecture was collapsing. The Versace family has always disputed certain elements of the media portrayal of Johnny's murder, particularly any suggestion of a prior significant relationship with Andrew. They view these speculations as disrespectful to Johnny's memory and dismissive of the real loss they experienced. 27 years have passed since that summer of 1997. The immediate shock has faded. The true crime documentaries and dramatizations have come and gone. Life has continued for those who survived. But certain questions linger. How did Andrew manage to evade one of the largest manhunts in American history for 2 months while hiding in plain sight? Why didn't someone recognize him despite his face being broadcast constantly? How did he manage to use his real name to pawn stolen goods without being caught? These aren't just academic questions. They point to systemic failures that allowed the killing to continue longer than it should have. Some in Miami Beach's gay community felt that law enforcement didn't take the threat seriously enough because the victims were primarily gay men. Whether or not this was conscious bias, the perception of inadequate response added another layer of pain to an already traumatic event. The case also raised questions about the intersection of fame, violence, and media coverage. Would Andrew have killed Versace if he hadn't known it would make him famous? Did the media's constant coverage of the manhunt, running Andrew's face and story continuously, feed his desire for notoriety and thus encourage rather than deter his final murder? These are uncomfortable questions with no clear answers. In Miami Beach today, Casa Casuarina still stands at 1116 Ocean Drive. It's now a luxury hotel and restaurant called The Villa. Tourists take photos on the front steps where Versace died, often unaware of the tragedy that occurred there. The city has moved on, as cities do. The grief that was so raw in July 1997 has been absorbed into history. But for those who were touched directly by Andrew Cunanan's violence, the moving on is harder. Duke Miglin said it best. There's never really closure in a situation like this, because closure requires understanding, and understanding requires answers, and Andrew Cunanan took all the answers with him when he pulled the trigger in that Miami houseboat. What we're left with is the wreckage. 5 families permanently scarred, a fashion empire forever changed, a case studied by forensic psychologists and criminal profilers trying to understand how someone becomes capable of such violence, and a name that will indeed be remembered, just as Andrew's high school classmates predicted, though not in the way anyone could have imagined. Perhaps the most important thing to understand about Andrew Cunanan is that there is no satisfying explanation. We want murders to make sense, to have clear motivations and logical progressions. We want to believe that if we understand the killer, we can prevent future killings. But sometimes the honest answer is simply that we don't know why. We can observe the factors that contributed, the lies, the narcissism, the collapse, the rage, but we can't fully reconstruct the interior experience that led to those specific acts of violence. And perhaps that's the most unsettling truth of all. That someone can destroy so many lives, cause so much suffering, and leave behind only questions. That the architecture of why remains incomplete, a structure with walls but no roof, offering no real protection from the rain of grief it left in its wake. Andrew Cunanan was cremated, his ashes interred at Holy Cross Cemetery in San Diego. There is no grand monument, no marker that would draw attention. Just a small placement in a mausoleum, the final resting place of someone who spent his entire life trying to be remarkable and ended up being remembered for all the wrong reasons. In the end, he got what he wanted. We remember him, but the memory is inseparable from the horror he created, the lives he stole, the grief he inflicted. And if there's any justice in that, it's cold comfort to those who survived him. 5 people died because Andrew Cunanan couldn't bear to be forgotten. The tragedy is that their deaths shouldn't be what defines his memory. Jeffrey Trail's service to his country, David Madsen's architectural talent, Lee Miglin's self-made success, William Reese's dedication to his work and family, Johnny Versace's artistic genius. These should be what we remember. But Andrew Cunanan ensured that his name would be forever linked with theirs, his darkness cast across their light. In the final accounting, that may be the cruelest thing he did. Not just taking their lives, but ensuring that even in death, even in memory, he would never let them go. The sun still rises over Miami Beach. The Atlantic still stretches away to the horizon. Life continues, as it always does, indifferent to the small tragedies we carve into its surface. But for those who know the story, there will always be a shadow on those steps at 1116 Ocean Drive. A question hanging in the air. A silence where explanations should be. And perhaps that silence, more than any answer, is the truest thing we can say about Andrew Cunanan and the summer of 1997 when 5 lives ended and 1 answer was lost forever. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. The Vanishing Voice of Woodstock. The Licorice McKechnie Mystery. She walked away from applause that echoed across 500,000 souls, then walked straight into the arms of something darker than silence. Fame found her on a stage where legends were born, but when she stepped down from that platform, she stepped into a void that would swallow her whole. We're tracking a woman who performed before the largest crowd in music history, then chose to become invisible. But this isn't about stardom lost. This is about a soul deliberately erased, a mind fractured between mysticism and madness, and a disappearance so complete that for 35 years, no one could say whether she breathed or lay buried in some unmarked desert grave. Her name was Licorice McKechnie, and what happened to her proves that sometimes the most terrifying monster isn't the one hunting you. It's the one you become. Born on October 2nd, 1945, in Edinburgh, Scotland, Christina McKechnie entered a world still smoldering from the ashes of war. But Christina, the girl who would later rechristen herself Licorice after her habit of rolling cigarettes with licorice-flavored paper, wasn't born to fit into the gray, austere post-war Scotland that surrounded her. From her earliest days, something set her apart, something wild and untethered that her own family would later describe as a free spirit. But beneath that romantic description lurked something more unsettling, a profound sense of not belonging that traced back to a childhood trauma that would shadow her entire existence. When Christina was just 3 years old, she fell seriously ill. The details of her condition remain obscured by time, but what is known is that she spent 3 months separated from her family, confined to a hospital bed while her young mind grappled with abandonment and isolation. Her sister Frances would later reflect that this early separation planted the seeds of something dark within Christina's psyche, a feeling of disconnection that would grow like poisonous ivy, wrapping itself around every relationship, every opportunity, every chance at normal life. By her teenage years, Christina had found her escape in the burgeoning Edinburgh folk scene. She haunted the city's folk clubs, reciting poetry with an intensity that captivated audiences. Her voice carried something ethereal, something that seemed to come from beyond the mundane world. It was in these smoke-filled venues that she met Robin Williamson, a multi-instrumentalist whose own artistic vision bordered on the mystical. But before Christina could fall fully into Williamson's orbit, she fixated on another folk musician, Bert Jansch, a revered figure in the British folk scene whose guitar work would later influence generations. Christina convinced herself she would marry Jansch. She left home with that singular purpose burning in her heart. The banns were published, the official declaration of their intent to wed. But then, in a devastating blow that would set the pattern for her entire life, Jansch left her behind to travel to Morocco in 1963. No goodbye, no explanation, just abandonment, again like a childhood illness come back to haunt her in a different form. According to Williamson, Christina fell into his arms after Jansch's departure. Whether this was love or simply the desperate need to belong to something, someone, anything to fill the void that had existed since that hospital room, remains unclear. What is clear is that Williamson saw something in Christina that transcended conventional talent. In 1967, he invited her to join the Incredible String Band as a vocalist and percussionist. The Incredible String Band was no ordinary folk group. They were pioneers of psychedelic folk, weaving together traditional Scottish music with Eastern instruments, esoteric spirituality, and the kind of experimental sound that defined the era's counterculture. When Christina joined, the band was on the precipice of international fame. Her first recorded contribution was backing vocals on Painting Box from their 1967 album, The 5,000 Spirits or The Layers of the Onion. Her voice, delicate yet otherworldly, added a dimension that critics and fans immediately recognized as magical. By 1968, Christina, now known exclusively as Licorice, had become a full member of the band alongside Williamson, Mike Herron, and another woman, Rose Simpson. The expanded lineup created a sound that was simultaneously ancient and futuristic, grounded in folk tradition, yet reaching towards something cosmic. Albums like The Hangman's Beautiful Daughter and We Tam and The Big Huge achieved critical acclaim and commercial success, climbing the British charts and attracting devoted fans across the Atlantic. Among their admirers were the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and Bob Dylan, who called their song October Song one of his all-time favorites. Paul McCartney would later describe one of their albums as the acoustic Sgt. Pepper's. Even Led Zeppelin acknowledged the Incredible String Band as a key influence. Licorice McKechnie wasn't just part of a successful band. She was part of a musical revolution. Then came August 1969, and an invitation that would cement Licorice's place in history, Woodstock. The Woodstock Music and Art Fair was meant to be a weekend of peace and music. Instead, it became a defining cultural moment, a 3-day festival that attracted over 400,000 people to Max Yaska's farm in Bethel, New York. The lineup read like a who's who of the era's greatest artists. Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, The Who, Creedence Clearwater Revival, and among them, the Incredible String Band. The band was originally scheduled to perform Friday evening alongside other folk acts like Joan Baez and Melanie. But when rain began to fall, Licorice and the band made a fateful decision. They refused to play. Whether this was due to concerns about their acoustic instruments or simply a reluctance to perform in adverse conditions, the choice haunted them. Folk singer Melanie took their slot and delivered such a memorable performance in the rain that she wrote her hit song, Candles in the Rain, about that very moment. The Incredible String Band was rescheduled for Saturday afternoon, placed between Creedence Clearwater Revival and Canned Heat, two powerhouse rock acts. The audience, primed for electric energy and hard-driving rhythms, didn't know what to make of the acoustic psychedelic folk that the Incredible String Band delivered. Though the band performed songs like The Letter, Gather Round, and This Moment, their set received a lukewarm response. The mystical, intricate arrangements that worked so beautifully on record seemed to dissolve in front of the massive crowd. There, on that stage with flowers woven into her long hair and wearing a flowing dress that epitomized hippie fashion, Licorice McKechnie sang before 500,000 people. Photographs from that day show her looking serene, almost transcendent, lost in the music. She appeared to embody the era's ideals of peace, love, and spiritual awakening. But those who knew her understood that beneath that ethereal surface, cracks were already forming. The very qualities that made Licorice magnetic, her otherworldliness, her detachment from material concerns, her intensity, were symptoms of something far more troubling than artistic temperament. The band members had begun exploring Scientology, the controversial religion founded by science fiction writer L. Ron Hubbard. In 1968, Licorice joined the Church of Scientology along with the other band members. The church's promises of spiritual enlightenment and its rejection of conventional psychiatry appealed to the band's countercultural sensibilities. For fans, their idols' involvement with Scientology lent the organization credibility. Many stringheads, as devoted fans called themselves, followed their heroes into the church. But Scientology, with its rigid hierarchy, its expensive courses, and its hostile stance towards psychiatric treatment, would prove to be a darkness disguised as light. And for someone like Licorice, whose mind was already beginning to fracture, the church's doctrines would become not a lifeline, but an anchor pulling her toward oblivion. After Woodstock, the incredible string band continued touring, but the magic was beginning to fade. By 1972, both Licorice and Rose Simpson had left the band. Licorice's romantic relationship with Robin Williamson had ended, and without that connection, her reason for remaining dissolved. The band itself would limp along for 2 more years before finally disbanding in 1974, with Williamson and Herron pursuing solo careers. For Licorice, leaving the band wasn't the end of her musical career. It was the beginning of her slow descent into a nightmare from which she would never fully wake. She had tasted fame, performed before the largest crowd in music history, contributed to albums that influenced generations. But none of that would save her from what came next. The girl from Edinburgh who'd once dreamed of marrying folk musicians and creating beautiful music was about to discover that fame offers no protection against the demons that live inside your own mind. And those demons were already whispering. California in the 1970s was a promised land for seekers, drifters, and those fleeing from who they used to be. It was here, in the Golden State where dreams were manufactured and broken in equal measure, that Licorice McKechnie landed after the incredible string band fell apart. She moved to Los Angeles first, joining a group called the Silver Moon Band, clinging to the hope that music might still save her. But the spotlight that had once illuminated her now felt more like an interrogation lamp, harsh and unforgiving. It was through Scientology that Licorice met Brian Lambert, a guitarist and songwriter who had been at Woodstock as a fan of the incredible string band. Lambert had joined the Church of Scientology because of the band. Like so many others, he believed that if his musical heroes endorsed it, it must offer genuine spiritual truth. When a friend gave him Licorice's phone number in either 1976 or 1977, Lambert can't remember exactly, he reached out. Within days of meeting, they decided to marry. The speed of their courtship wasn't romantic. It was desperate, 2 people drowning who thought they might save each other by holding on tight. They performed together at Scientology events, trying to build a career on the church's circuit. They recorded music together. But success, that elusive creature that had once seemed so attainable, remained frustratingly out of reach. After the string band, it was a slow descent, unfortunately. Lambert would later recall with the kind of resignation that comes from watching someone you love slip away inch by inch. But it wasn't just Licorice's career that was descending. Lambert witnessed something terrifying happening to the woman he'd married. "I saw her become, like, schizophrenic," he explained years later, his words careful, trying to describe something that defied easy explanation. There were times where she was beautiful and happy and fun to be around. Then other times, a switch would flip. The switch, that's what he called it. One moment, Licorice would be present, warm, the person he'd fallen for. The next, something else would take control. Her eyes would change. Her voice would change. She would hear things that weren't there, respond to voices only she could perceive. She would become paranoid, convinced of conspiracies and threats invisible to everyone around her. Then, just as suddenly, she would return, the storm passing as mysteriously as it had arrived. This wasn't artistic temperament or the eccentricity expected from musicians. This was mental illness, serious and untreated. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. Scientology, the organization both Licorice and Lambert had embraced, categorically rejects psychiatry and psychiatric medication. The church teaches that mental illness is caused by engrams, traumatic memories stored in the reactive mind, and can only be cured through Scientology's own processes, particularly auditing, where members are questioned while hooked up to an e-meter, a crude lie detector, for someone experiencing symptoms of schizophrenia, a condition that typically requires antipsychotic medication and therapeutic intervention. Scientology's rejection of conventional treatment was catastrophic. Instead of receiving help, Licorice was steered away from it. Instead of medication that might stabilize her fractured mind, she was subjected to more auditing sessions, more courses, more financial drain as the church promised enlightenment that never came. Lambert eventually left Scientology in the early 1980s, around the same time he and Licorice divorced. He is now an outspoken critic of the church, speaking with the bitter clarity of someone who watched its doctrines contribute to a tragedy. But the divorce was amicable. Licorice even paid the $90 filing fee. "We were still pretty friendly at the end," Lambert remembered. "Even during our divorce, we were friendly." They stayed friends after the divorce, keeping in occasional contact. And that's when Lambert witnessed something that disturbed him even more than the schizophrenic episodes. Licorice began deliberately choosing homelessness. "She literally made a conscious decision to become homeless," Lambert said, and you can hear the bewilderment in his words, the incomprehension of someone watching another human being systematically dismantle their own life. "She would sleep in vacant lots. One time I found her asleep in the back of my house. She wasn't upset. She would have a waitress job from time to make money. But she just loved being homeless." Lambert tried to understand. Licorice told him about the Tinkers, an outdated term for Irish traveler communities in Scotland, nomadic people who lived outside conventional society. "She used to tell me how she envied the fact that they had no connection to the material world," Lambert explained. To Licorice, homelessness wasn't a failure. It was freedom. It wasn't degradation. It was liberation from the very concept of property, routine, and social expectations that she had always felt crushed by. But was this philosophy, or was this mental illness? Was Licorice choosing this life, or was her fractured mind making the choice for her? The truth likely existed somewhere in the terrible gray area between the two. A woman whose inherent nonconformity and childhood sense of not belonging had been amplified and distorted by untreated mental illness into something that looked like choice but was actually compulsion. She drifted. Los Angeles, Sacramento, back to Los Angeles. She took temporary waitress jobs, never revealing her past fame, never mentioning that she had once stood on the Woodstock stage before 500,000 people. To her co-workers, she was just Christina, odd, quiet, a woman with a lingering Scottish accent who didn't quite fit in but wasn't entirely unfriendly. She would work just long enough to earn some money, then disappear back into the streets, sleeping in vacant lots, living a life that mystified everyone who'd once known her. In 1986, Licorice made a final trip back to Edinburgh to visit her family. It was a brief visit, and those who saw her remarked on how distant she seemed, how disconnected. Her sister Frances said they had lost touch for a long time, even before Licorice's ultimate disappearance, describing her as a very free spirit, with a carefully maintained neutrality that suggested both love and exhaustion. Then, in 1990, Frances received a letter. It was postmarked from Sacramento, California. In it, Licorice wrote about having recently undergone major surgery. The details were vague, the tone detached. It read less like a letter from a sister and more like a message from someone already halfway gone, maintaining the bare minimum of contact out of some residual sense of obligation rather than genuine connection. That letter, delivered to a home in Scotland from a hospital in California, would be the last verified contact anyone would have with Licorice McKechnie. Meanwhile, conflicting stories about her whereabouts began to circulate. Some claimed she was last seen in 1987, hitchhiking across the Arizona desert, her thumb out on a lonely highway as the brutal sun beat down on a landscape that had killed countless unprepared travelers. The image was cinematic and terrifying. A woman alone in the desert, walking towards something or away from everything, moving through heat and emptiness like a ghost already. Others believed she had remained in Northern California, living among the homeless population, one anonymous woman among thousands sleeping on sidewalks and in abandoned buildings. There were occasional unverified sightings. Someone who looked like her, someone with a Scottish accent, someone who seemed somehow out of place even among society's most displaced. Lambert's contact with her became increasingly sporadic through the early 1980s, then stopped entirely. He can't remember the exact last time he saw her. The disappearance was slow and gradual, he said. I don't know if she saw her past existence as something that she just wanted to separate herself out of. But that's exactly what she did. She just cut everybody off and gave nobody any information. By the late 1980s, Licorice McKechnie had achieved what few people in the modern world ever manage. She had made herself completely untraceable. No phone number, no address, no paper trail. In an era before the internet, before social media, before the digital surveillance that now makes disappearing nearly impossible, Licorice simply stepped off the grid and into a void. And for 35 years, that void gave no answers. Only questions. Questions that would haunt former bandmates, family members, fans, and anyone who'd ever been touched by that ethereal voice that once floated over a field of 500,000 souls. Was she alive somewhere, choosing invisibility over connection? Was she dead? Her body lying in some unmarked grave or decomposing in the desert where no one would ever find it? Or had she become something else entirely, not alive or dead but existing in some in-between state, neither fully present in the world nor entirely absent from it? The darkness that had been whispering to her since childhood had finally consumed her completely. But the question remained. Had she been devoured, or had she willingly walked into its mouth? When someone vanishes as completely as Licorice McKechnie did, they leave behind a vacuum that human imagination rushes to fill. Nature abhors a vacuum, but human nature transforms it into mythology. And so began the ghost stories, whispered theories, unverified sightings, and increasingly desperate attempts by those who'd loved her to understand what happened to the woman who'd simply erased herself from existence. Music journalist Mark Ellen, writing in Mojo magazine in 2000, reported that Licorice was last seen in 1987 hitchhiking across the Arizona desert. Not even her family has heard from her since. This single line, published in a respected music magazine, became the dominant narrative. It had everything a mystery needed: a specific year, a specific location, and an image pregnant with terrible possibility. The Arizona desert is not a forgiving place. Summer temperatures regularly exceed 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Dehydration can kill in hours. The landscape is beautiful and merciless, filled with cacti, scorpions, rattlesnakes, and endless stretches where a person could die and never be found. Every year, bodies are discovered in the desert. Migrants who died attempting to cross the border, hikers who underestimated the terrain, and others who simply walked out into that heat and never walked back. The idea of Licorice hitchhiking through this environment captured imaginations worldwide. Was she picked up by the wrong person, someone with darker intentions than offering a ride? Did she wander off the highway and succumb to the elements? Or was the desert merely a metaphor? Not where she died, but where she chose to disappear, walking into the landscape like some modern mystic seeking dissolution. But this 1987 Arizona sighting was never confirmed. It existed in that murky territory of secondhand information, the kind of story that gets repeated until it achieves the weight of fact despite having no verifiable source. The truth was, no one knew where Licorice had gone. The 1990 letter from Sacramento suggested she was still in California. But Sacramento to Arizona isn't an impossible journey. Maybe she'd left California. Maybe the surgery mentioned in that letter had been serious enough to frighten her into movement, into running from yet another thing she couldn't control. Rose Simpson, Licorice's fellow incredible string band member and the only other woman who'd shared that Woodstock stage, offered her own grim assessment. "There's a possibility she may be dead," Simpson stated with the blunt pragmatism of someone who'd seen enough of life to know how these stories often end. Later, she added more detail. "She is either not alive or not part of any society that relies on money. I know people claim to know her, and I have even been sent a supposed photo, but I can't say I recognized her." That last part was particularly chilling. People had sent Rose photos of women they believed might be Licorice and Rose, who'd spent years performing alongside her, who'd lived communally with her, who'd shared dressing rooms and stages and the intimate proximity of band life. Couldn't recognize her. Had Licorice changed so dramatically? Or were these photos simply of other women, other ghosts, other people the world had forgotten? There was also the matter of money. Considerable royalties had accumulated from the incredible string band's catalog, boosted by re-releases and the re-edit of the Woodstock film. These royalties, legally belonging to Licorice, sat unclaimed. For those trying to determine her fate, this unclaimed money seemed significant. If she were alive and contactable, surely she would claim what was hers? The fact that the money remained untouched suggested either death or a disconnection from normal society so profound that even substantial sums held no appeal. Brian Lambert, reflecting on his ex-wife's disappearance decades later, offered his own theory. "If I had to guess, I would say that she made a decision to separate herself from everyone," he said. "The fact that she didn't contact us just means that she really wants to have that firewall between herself and her past." Firewall. The word choice is telling. Not a barrier, not a boundary, but a firewall, something designed to protect from danger, from infection, from something that could destroy you if it got through. Lambert believed Licorice saw her past, including everyone in it, as a threat to whatever fragile equilibrium she'd managed to construct. Maintaining that equilibrium required absolute severance. But Lambert also admitted to darker thoughts. He'd witnessed her mental deterioration. He'd seen her choosing homelessness, living in vacant lots, existing on the margins even when she had other options. He'd watched her schizophrenic episodes, the way her personality would fracture and reassemble into something unrecognizable. "I would say there's a good possibility she's not alive," he finally conceded, the words clearly painful. "She had mental health issues. She was living on the streets. That's not a safe way to live." The online communities that form around missing persons cases latched onto Licorice's story with obsessive intensity. Forums dedicated to mysterious disappearances featured lengthy threads speculating about what happened. Some believed she'd been murdered, perhaps by someone who'd picked her up while hitchhiking. Others thought she died by suicide, walking into the desert or the ocean as a final act of will. Still others maintained she was alive somewhere, having achieved what she'd always wanted. Complete anonymity, a life where the past held no claim on her. True crime enthusiasts created timelines, mapping every known fact about her last years. What jobs had she worked? Which cities had she definitely been in? Who had spoken to her last? The obsession was understandable but also slightly morbid, reducing a human being's tragedy to puzzle pieces that might never fit together. Her family's response was notably restrained. Frances Harding, Licorice's sister, had accepted years ago that Licorice would likely never return. "She was certainly a very free spirit," Frances said, a phrase she repeated like a mantra, perhaps to convince herself that Licorice's disappearance was choice rather than catastrophe. Frances traced this free spirit quality back to that childhood illness, that 3-month separation when Licorice was only 3 years old. "I feel a sense of not belonging must have first asserted itself from her early illness, a near-total separation from the family at 3 years old for 3 months. Other family members, including Frances's sons, had at one point attempted to locate Licorice, following what few leads existed to Sacramento. But the trail went cold. Sacramento is a large city, and a woman determined not to be found, especially if living on the streets or in transient situations, could remain invisible indefinitely. What haunted everyone who'd known Licorice wasn't just her absence. It was the totality of it. Most people who go missing leave traces: credit card transactions, phone calls, social security number usage, DMV records, medical records. The modern administrative state creates a paper trail for everyone. But Licorice had somehow managed to exist outside all of that. Or she hadn't existed at all, at least not in any way that left evidence. There were the inevitable conspiracy theories. Some claimed Scientology knew where she was but was hiding her, either because she knew too much about the organization or because they were conducting some kind of experiment on her. These theories, while dramatic, found little supporting evidence beyond the church's well-documented history of controlling and surveilling members. Others wondered if she'd assumed a new identity, perhaps even getting married again under a different name. California's homeless population included many people who'd once been someone else, who'd walked away from former lives and former identities. Maybe Licorice was among them, living under a name only she knew, serving coffee in some diner, sleeping in a shelter, moving through the world like a shadow cast by someone who no longer exists. By 2000, with the new millennium arrived and Y2K having proven to be a non-event, Licorice McKechnie had been gone for at least a decade, possibly longer. The 1960s counterculture she'd been part of was now ancient history, the subject of nostalgia and academic study. Woodstock had its 30th anniversary, and aged hippies gathered to reminisce about peace and love and music that changed the world. The Incredible String Band was remembered as a seminal influence, their albums revered by new generations of folk musicians. But Licorice was a ghost story, a cautionary tale, a mystery that seemed destined never to be solved. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, who had appeared on Desert Island Discs and chosen the Incredible String Band's The Hedgehog's Song as one of his selections, wrote a foreword for a book about the band in 2003. He described them as holy, but holiness and health are not the same thing, and the band's mystical inclinations, combined with their involvement in Scientology, had led at least one member into a darkness that seemed to have no exit. In 2020, Rose Simpson published a memoir titled Muse, Odalisque, Handmaiden, A Girl's Life in the Incredible String Band. In it, she discussed the band's glory years, the cultural moment they'd helped create, and the eventual dissolution of it all. But when it came to Licorice, even Rose, who'd been there, who'd lived it, had more questions than answers. The ghost stories continued. Every few years, someone would claim to have seen her. She was in Portland. She was in San Francisco. She was in some small town in Oregon working in a library. But these sightings were never confirmed, always secondhand, always dissolving into uncertainty when examined closely. What remained were photographs from the 1960s and early 1970s. A beautiful young woman with flowers in her hair, a slight smile playing at her lips, eyes that suggested she was seeing something just beyond the camera's frame. In those images, she looked like the embodiment of an era, the perfect crystallization of everything the 1960s promised: freedom, art, spirituality, transcendence. But promises and reality diverge. And the reality was that somewhere out there, either alive or dead, earthbound or ascended, the woman in those photographs had vanished so completely that she'd become more myth than person, more mystery than memory. And the ghost stories, devoid of ending or resolution, simply continued. For 35 years, Licorice McKechnie existed in a peculiar state of quantum uncertainty, simultaneously alive and dead, present and absent, real and mythological. She was Schrodinger's musician, her fate unknown until someone finally opened the box. But unlike that famous thought experiment, opening this particular box wouldn't collapse the wave function into certainty. It would only deepen the mystery. Music continued to evolve. The psychedelic folk that the Incredible String Band pioneered found new practitioners. Artists like Joanna Newsom, Devendra Banhart, and countless others drew inspiration from that late 1960s sound, creating what critics called New Weird America or freak folk. In interviews, some of these musicians mentioned the Incredible String Band as influences, and occasionally Licorice McKechnie's name would appear in discussions about the band's lineup. But always with a caveat: her whereabouts are unknown. She disappeared in the 1980s. She may be deceased. The uncertainty had become part of her identity, inseparable from her music. She was the Amelia Earhart of psychedelic folk, the D.B. Cooper of the counterculture, someone whose disappearance had become more famous than anything they'd actually done. On internet forums dedicated to mysterious disappearances, Licorice's case was discussed alongside more sinister stories. Murdered women, kidnapped children, people who'd walked into forests and never emerged. The tone of these discussions varied. Some treated her disappearance with the gravity it deserved, recognizing the tragedy of mental illness and society's failures. Others approached it with a ghoulish fascination, as if her life were merely a puzzle to be solved, a mystery to entertain them during lunch breaks. Occasionally, someone claiming to have insider knowledge would appear on these forums. They'd hint at knowing where she was, at having seen her recently, at possessing information they couldn't share publicly. These claims always evaporated under scrutiny, revealed as attention-seeking fantasies or genuine but mistaken identity. The woman spotted in a Sacramento homeless encampment wasn't Licorice. The Scottish accent heard at a Portland grocery store belonged to someone else. The familiar face glimpsed at a Los Angeles bus stop was just someone who bore a passing resemblance. Brian Lambert, growing older, occasionally gave interviews about his time with Licorice and his experiences with Scientology. He'd become an advocate for exposing the church's practices, particularly its rejection of psychiatric care. If Licorice had gotten proper treatment, he would say, the regret evident in his voice, things might have been different, but might have been are the cruelest words in the English language, offering hope while simultaneously acknowledging its irrelevance. In Scotland, Frances Harding aged as well. She'd long since accepted that her sister was gone, probably permanently. The hope of reunion had faded years ago, replaced by a quiet grief for someone who was neither provably dead nor meaningfully alive. It's a unique kind of loss, this ambiguous grief, where closure never comes because the story has no ending. The unclaimed royalties continued to accumulate. Every stream of Painting Box on Spotify, every purchase of The Hangman's Beautiful Daughter on vinyl by a new generation of listeners, every YouTube video using an incredible string band song, all of it generated money that rightfully belonged to Licorice but went uncollected. The sum grew larger each year, a monument to absence, a fortune gathering dust because its rightful owner had either died or rejected the very concept of ownership so thoroughly that money held no meaning. Then, in November 2025, everything changed. A British journalist, working on a feature about forgotten musicians of the 1960s, decided to investigate Licorice McKechnie's disappearance. This wasn't the first journalist to pursue the story. Dozens had tried and failed over the decades. But this particular journalist had resources and persistence. They followed the few solid leads that existed. The 1990 letter from Sacramento, the speculation from Frances's family that she might still be in that city, the fragmented accounts from Brian Lambert about her patterns and preferences. Sacramento, California, the state capital, located in Northern California's Central Valley, a city large enough to get lost in but small enough that a determined search might yield results. The journalist began methodically checking public records, homeless shelters, low-income housing databases. They showed Licorice's old photographs to people who worked with the city's homeless population. They knocked on doors in neighborhoods where rent was cheap and questions were few. And then, impossibly, they found her. Christina McKechnie, no longer going by Licorice, never mentioning her past, living under her birth name, was alive. She resided in a modest apartment building in Sacramento, existing in near-total anonymity. Her neighbors knew her only as Christina, a quiet woman with a faint Scottish accent who kept to herself and rarely went out. She didn't make friends. She didn't socialize. She was just another elderly woman in a building full of elderly people, unremarkable and unremembered. The journalist approached carefully, aware that after 35 years of deliberate invisibility, Christina McKechnie clearly didn't want to be found. An intercom call went unanswered. A phone number associated with the apartment was disconnected. Notes left at her door were ignored. She had built her firewall, and she had no intention of dismantling it. One neighbor, speaking to the journalist, said, "She's very quiet and private. She doesn't go out much. She mostly keeps to herself and is often difficult to get hold of. Another added that Christina seemed not especially friendly, a woman who'd mastered the art of existing in proximity to others without truly engaging with them. The revelation was simultaneously mundane and shocking. After decades of speculation about desert deaths and sinister fates, the truth was almost disappointingly simple. Licorice McKechnie had achieved exactly what she'd always seemed to want. She'd erased herself. Not through death, but through the sheer force of will required to maintain complete disconnection from everyone and everything she'd once been. She wasn't dead in the Arizona desert. She hadn't been murdered. She hadn't joined a cult or been held against her will. She'd simply decided that Christina McKechnie, folk singer, Woodstock performer, member of the incredible string band, no longer existed. And in her place was someone else, someone with the same face and voice but a completely different life. Or perhaps no life at all in any meaningful sense, just existence, continuation, breathing in and breathing out in a small apartment in Sacramento. When the news broke, reactions varied wildly. Some of her former fans were relieved. She was alive. She was safe. She'd made her choice and should be respected. Others felt betrayed, as if her deliberate disappearance had been a selfish act, denying them closure or connection. Still others saw it as the ultimate act of agency, a woman who'd taken complete control of her narrative by refusing to have one at all. Brian Lambert's response, when reached for comment, was measured. "I'm glad she's alive," he said. "I hope she's found some peace." But beneath those careful words, you could sense the weight of unanswered questions. Had it been worth it? The marriage that failed, the career that dissolved, the years of mental anguish. Had Christina found on the other side of all that something resembling contentment? Frances Harding, now in her late 70s, was informed that her sister was alive and living in Sacramento. The sisters did not reunite. Christina made no attempt to reach out, and Frances, respecting her sister's clearly stated wish for privacy, did not push. "She made her choice a long time ago," Frances said simply. The grief in those words wasn't fresh. It had been weathered and worn smooth by decades of acceptance. The journalist who found Christina chose not to publish her exact address or identifying details beyond the city. The article acknowledged finding her but respected her privacy, understanding that exposing someone who'd worked so hard to remain hidden would be an act of violence, however well-intentioned. The story wasn't woman found after decades. It was woman chose to disappear and succeeded. In the weeks following the revelation, there was a brief surge of interest in the incredible string band's music. Streaming numbers increased. Old albums were pulled from collections and played again. YouTube comments sections filled with people newly aware of Licorice's story, debating whether her choice was brave or tragic, sane or symptomatic of the very illness that had plagued her. But Christina McKechnie, living in her Sacramento apartment, remained unreachable. She didn't issue statements. She didn't clarify her story. She simply continued doing what she'd been doing for 35 years, refusing to be the person everyone wanted her to be. The unclaimed royalties remained unclaimed. The money, substantial enough to transform her modest existence into something far more comfortable, held no appeal. Or perhaps she simply didn't know it existed, having so thoroughly severed connections with her former life that information about royalties never reached her. Or maybe, and this is perhaps most likely, she knew about the money and rejected it deliberately, understanding that claiming it would mean acknowledging her past identity, and that acknowledgement would shatter the careful separation she'd maintained. Mental health professionals, hearing her story, offered various interpretations. Some saw classic symptoms of schizophrenia coupled with a personality disorder that made connection unbearable. Others pointed to unresolved childhood trauma, that 3-month separation at age 3 creating an attachment wound that never healed. Still others suggested that maybe, just maybe, this was simply who she was. Someone for whom solitude wasn't loneliness but sanctuary, and disconnection wasn't loss but liberation. The question that haunted everyone who knew her story was simple and impossible. Was Christina McKechnie happy? Happiness seems like an inadequate word for whatever state she'd achieved. Living alone in Sacramento, cut off from family and friends, existing without apparent purpose or connection. Was that happiness, or just the absence of suffering? Was the silence she'd cultivated peace, or simply numbness? Did she wake each morning grateful for her anonymity, or did she lie in bed haunted by ghosts of concerts never given, songs never written, relationships never cultivated? We'll never know. Christina McKechnie, having become a whisper, refused to become loud again. Her story ended not with a bang or even a whimper, but with silence. The same silence she'd been seeking since 1990, or perhaps since 1963 when Bert Jansch left her behind, or maybe since 1948 when a 3-year-old girl lay in a hospital bed feeling abandoned and alone. The incredible string band's music endures. The Hedgehog's song still moves listeners to tears with its simple beauty. October Song remains on Bob Dylan's list of favorites. Albums like The Hangman's Beautiful Daughter are studied by music students and treasured by collectors. The band influenced generations of musicians who never met them, and their psychedelic folk continues to sound fresh and vital decades after it was recorded. And on those albums, if you listen carefully, you can hear her voice. Licorice McKechnie, singing backing vocals on Painting Box, contributing to songs that would outlive her public existence. Her voice, preserved in analog grooves and digital files, remains even though the woman herself chose to vanish. That voice, ethereal and haunting, carries something beyond mere technical skill. You can hear in it the quality that made her magnetic on stage, a sense of not quite belonging to this world, of being slightly adjacent to normal reality. Listening now, knowing what happened, the voice sounds prophetic. She sang as if she were already disappearing, already becoming the ghost she would eventually choose to be. In the end, Licorice McKechnie achieved something remarkable and terrible. She proved that, in the modern world, disappearance is still possible if you want it badly enough. That anonymity can be maintained if you're willing to sacrifice everything for it. That a person can become so thoroughly disconnected that they exist in society without being part of it, visible but unseen, alive but absent. Her life stands as a warning about untreated mental illness, about the dangers of organizations like Scientology that reject psychiatric care, about the price of fame and the weight of early trauma. But it also stands as something else, a strange, sad testament to human will, to the lengths one person will go to construct a life on their own terms, no matter how incomprehensible those terms seem to everyone else. The woman who sang before 500,000 people at Woodstock ended her days, or continues them still, in a Sacramento apartment, unknown and unremembered by those around her. She traded applause for silence, fame for anonymity, connection for absolute solitude. And whether that trade was worth it, whether she found what she was looking for in that silence, remains a mystery even now. Christina McKechnie, born 1945 in Edinburgh, Scotland. Folk singer, percussionist, Woodstock performer. Last heard from in 1990. Found alive in 2025. Still unreachable. Still unknowable. Still, after all these years and all this searching, exactly what she chose to be, invisible. The monster wasn't out there hunting her. The monster was the world itself, its expectations, its demands, its insistence that people remain findable and known. And when she stepped into the darkness to escape that monster, she discovered something worse. That the only way to be truly free of it was to become a ghost while still breathing. Some mysteries solve nothing when solved. Some answers only deepen the questions. And some people, no matter how hard we look for them, were never really lost. They were just somewhere we couldn't follow, somewhere beyond the reach of anyone who still believed that connection was necessary, that being known was desirable, that a life lived completely alone was a life wasted. Christina McKechnie would disagree. And she has spent the last 35 years proving it, one silent day after another, in an apartment in Sacramento where no one knows her name and no one ever will. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now let's move on to our third story. Story 3. The Vanishing at Tres Pontes. The Tito Mendez Case. A mother's desperate search. A killer's confession. Decades of unanswered screams. When children began vanishing from the Amazon's shadows, no one expected the horror that lurked closer than anyone dared to believe. 13-year-old boys don't simply evaporate into thin air. They leave behind footprints, witnesses, traces of their last moments. But on January 20th, 1991, in the remote Amazonian municipality of Altamira, Brazil, Tito Mendez Vieira walked toward a stream to cool off from the equatorial heat and became a ghost. The water that day held no answers. The mangoes he planned to buy remained unpicked. The only clue to his fate was a single, chilling detail. Someone saw him walking away with a stranger, a man whose face would haunt an entire region for decades to come. What happened at Tres Pontes that sweltering afternoon wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was one thread in a tapestry of nightmares so twisted, so methodical, that when the truth finally surfaced, it shattered every assumption about the monsters who walk among us. Altamira sprawls across 159,533 square kilometers of Brazilian rainforest, larger than Missouri, larger than 104 entire countries, yet paradoxically suffocating in its remoteness. The municipality sits along the Xingu River, a tributary whose dark waters wind through dense jungle where modernity dissolves into something ancient and unforgiving. By 1991, Altamira had grown from its origins as an 18th-century Jesuit mission into a frontier town of roughly 80,000 souls, most scraping out existence through rubber extraction, logging, and subsistence farming. Poverty wasn't just common here. It was atmospheric, pressing down on families like the humidity that never quite lifted from the air. For children like Tito Mendez Vieira, life meant finding joy in simple freedoms, swimming in the Igarapes, the streams that carved through the landscape, kicking worn soccer balls on dusty fields, climbing mango trees whose fruit hung heavy and sweet in the suffocating heat. 13 years old, Tito belonged to that precarious age between childhood innocence and adolescent awareness, still young enough to see adventure in everyday moments, yet old enough to recognize the weight his family carried. January 20th, 1991, arrived like any other day in Altamira's wet season. The morning sun climbed quickly, turning the air into something you wore rather than breathed. Tito made plans that seemed utterly ordinary, the kind of plans thousands of boys his age made across Brazil that same day. He would walk to the Tres Pontes stream, 3 bridges, a local spot where the Am Creek offered relief from the relentless tropical heat. The water there ran cool and clear, a temporary escape from the dust and sweat that clung to everything. After his swim, he intended to pick up some mangoes, maybe share them with his family, maybe sell a few for pocket change. His mother watched him leave that morning, unaware she was witnessing a departure that would cleave her life into 2 distinct halves, before and after. There was no premonition, no maternal instinct screaming danger. How could there be? Boys swam in Igarapes every single day. The rainforest, for all its dangers, venomous snakes, jaguars, the ever-present threat of drowning, felt more familiar than fearsome to those who'd grown up within its embrace. Tito reached Tres Pontes sometime in the early afternoon. Witnesses would later recall seeing him there, his lean frame cutting through the water, droplets catching sunlight as he surfaced for air. The stream gurgled over smooth stones, insects hummed in the canopy overhead, and for a brief window of time, everything was exactly as it should be. But somewhere between that swim and his intended errand for mangoes, Tito's trajectory intersected with something malevolent. A witness, whose name would become buried in police reports, saw Tito in the company of an unknown man. Not a relative, not a family friend, not anyone the witness recognized from Altamira's tight-knit community where faces became familiar through sheer repetition. Just a man, an unknown man. The detail was mentioned, noted, and then, crucially, not immediately investigated with the urgency it deserved. In Altamira, in 1991, a boy walking with an unknown man didn't automatically trigger alarm bells. Perhaps it should have. Perhaps by that point it already should have, because Tito never picked up those mangoes. He never returned home that evening, his clothes damp from the stream, his pockets jangling with whatever coins he'd earned. Sunset came and went, painting the Amazon sky in violent oranges and purples before surrendering to darkness. Families lit kerosene lamps. Doors closed against the night's chorus of insects and unknown things moving through the underbrush. And in one home, Tito's mother began the agonizing transition from annoyance to concern to something colder and more terrible: dread. By the next morning, when Tito still hadn't appeared, his mother did what any parent would do. She went to the police. Here's where the nightmare compounded itself. She encountered resistance. Not outright refusal, but bureaucratic lethargy, the institutional shrug of authorities who'd seen too many poor families, too many missing persons reports that resolved themselves with embarrassed teenagers returning home or bodies found floating after accidental drownings. Documentation was slow. Questions were asked with the kind of skepticism that suggested maybe she hadn't looked hard enough, maybe the boy had run away, maybe this would all sort itself out without requiring actual investigative work. But it wouldn't sort itself out. Tito Mendez Vieira had vanished into a void that was simultaneously specific and vast. Specific in that someone had engineered his disappearance with deliberate intention. Vast in that the Amazon rainforest could swallow evidence, bodies, entire histories without leaving a trace. The streams that brought joy and relief could also become tombs. The forest that provided livelihood could also conceal atrocities. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Tito's absence transformed from a crisis into a cruel new reality his family had to learn to inhabit. Other families in Altamira were learning the same horrific lesson, though most didn't know it yet. The connections hadn't been made. The pattern hadn't been recognized. The scope of what was happening remained hidden like so much else in the tangled depths of the rainforest. 3 years would pass before Tito's mother experienced something that, in retrospect, drips with significance. In November 1995, she recounted a deeply unsettling incident from 1992, roughly a year after Tito's disappearance. A woman named Rosa had approached one of her sons, warning him urgently not to leave the house. Rosa appeared agitated, frightened, insisting she was being followed by police officers. The encounter was brief, cryptic, charged with unexplained terror. Later that same day, gunshots echoed from the direction of the Igarape. The next morning, Rosa's body was pulled from the water by those same police officers she'd claimed were pursuing her. What did Rosa know? Who was she fleeing from? Why was she killed near the very stream where Tito had last been seen alive? These questions dangled unanswered, adding layers of paranoia and conspiracy to an already incomprehensible tragedy. If the police were somehow involved, if authority figures themselves were compromised, then where could families turn? Who could be trusted when the institutions designed to protect might themselves be instruments of harm? The Amazon doesn't give up its secrets easily. The forest floor, perpetually damp and teeming with decomposers, can reduce human remains to scattered bones within weeks. Rivers can carry bodies miles from where they entered the water. And in a region where poverty makes people invisible even in life, disappearing in death becomes almost inevitable. Tito Mendez Vieira was one boy in one town in one corner of an impossibly vast country. His absence, devastating as it was to his family, barely registered in the broader consciousness of Brazil in 1991. But Tito wasn't alone in his fate. He was part of something much larger, much more deliberate, and much more horrifying than a single opportunistic crime. The same thing that had claimed him was hunting throughout Altamira, selecting victims with a methodical precision that suggested not impulsive violence but calculated predation. And the man who engineered these disappearances, who stalked the Igarapes and dusty streets with practiced ease, was just beginning to perfect his terrible craft. To understand what happened to Tito Mendez Vieira, you must first understand what was happening to Altamira itself. A slow-motion catastrophe that authorities either couldn't see or refused to acknowledge until the body count became impossible to ignore. Between 1989 and 1993, Boys aged 8 to 14 began disappearing from this frontier municipality with a frequency that transcended coincidence and entered the realm of systematic predation. But this wasn't random violence. These weren't accidents. Something calculated was unfolding in the shadows of the Amazon, and its methodology was as horrifying as its execution. The victims shared chilling commonalities. They were poor, often from families barely surviving on the margins of Altamira's already marginal economy. They were vulnerable, frequently unsupervised out of necessity rather than neglect. Parents working long hours at jobs that barely kept roofs overhead, children left to navigate the town streets and streams with the kind of independence that poverty demands. They were young boys, specifically, in that narrow window before puberty fully transforms a child's body. And they were targeted with a precision that suggested their killer knew exactly what he was looking for. Some boys vanished completely, swallowed by the rainforest without leaving any trace beyond frantic families filing reports with skeptical police. Others were found, but in conditions so grotesque that even hardened investigators struggled to maintain professional detachment. The survivors, and yes, incredibly, there were survivors, carried physical and psychological scars that would never fully heal. Their testimonies painted a picture of calculated savagery that defied comprehension. Oatmeal was 10 years old when a man approached him on November 16, 1989, offering something simple and irresistible: mangoes. The same fruit Tito would be seeking 2 years later. The man led Oatmeal on what seemed like a short walk, just into the tree line where mangoes grew heavy on low-hanging branches. But once they were sufficiently isolated from witnesses, the man produced a cloth, soaked in something chemical, something that burned the nostrils and brought darkness rushing in from the edges. Oatmeal lost consciousness. When he woke, he was bleeding from between his legs, mutilated in a way that destroyed not just his body but any chance of a normal life. He'd been castrated with surgical precision, his genitals removed entirely. Somehow, mercifully, he survived. The man had left him for dead, assuming the trauma and blood loss would finish what he'd started. But Oatmeal crawled toward civilization, toward help, toward a future that would require dozens of reconstructive surgeries and ongoing psychological treatment that continues to this day. Waldeckley was 9 years old when, on July 23, 1990, a stranger asked for his help retrieving a kite stuck in a tree. It's such an innocent request, the kind of thing neighbors ask children all the time. The kite was just over there, just a little ways into the forest. The boy agreed because children are helpful, because adults are supposed to be trustworthy, because nothing in his short life had taught him to fear this particular request. The same chloroform-soaked cloth, the same forced unconsciousness, the same mutilation, castration performed with tools that suggested practice, experience, a methodology refined through repetition. The same sexual assault that compounded physical horror with psychological annihilation. Waldeckley also survived, also faced a lifetime of surgeries and therapy, also became a living testament to evil that walks upright and speaks in human voices. But others weren't as fortunate as Oatmeal and Waldeckley, if fortunate is even remotely the appropriate word for boys who survived such trauma. Hilton Fonseca, age 10, disappeared on May 5, 1991, just months after Tito. His family filed a police report that was processed with the same bureaucratic sluggishness that had characterized Tito's case. 46 days later, Ailton's remains were discovered. His body, like those of other victims, bore the signature marks: castration, evidence of sexual violence, the systematic removal of identifying features that suggested someone who understood how to delay identification, to obscure forensic evidence, to buy time for trails to grow cold. Ailton's body was transported to the morgue in Belém, the state capital, for examination. But before experts could conduct thorough analysis, the body vanished from the morgue itself. Simply disappeared from a secure facility. This wasn't incompetence. This was intervention. Someone with access, with authority, with the power to make evidence disappear, had done exactly that. Gertali da Cunha, 13 years old, the same age as Tito, vanished on January 1, 1992. Witnesses reported seeing him socializing with an unknown individual at a construction site. Then nothing. Then, days later, his body surfaced, naked, castrated, bearing signs of sexual violence, perforations, and burns. The burns were particularly noteworthy. They suggested torture, deliberate infliction of pain beyond what was necessary for murder. They suggested someone who derived satisfaction from suffering, who extended the agony beyond any utilitarian purpose. Ednaldo de Souza Teixeira, 12 years old, killed on April 11, 1992. His body was found beside an artesian well, beaten so severely that bone fragments were visible through torn flesh. The castration had occurred post-mortem this time, suggesting the killer's rage had peaked during the beating itself. The mutilation serving some ritualistic purpose after death had already occurred. Janes da Silva Pessoa, 13 years old, murdered on October 1, 1992, while performing the simple, rural task of tending his family's cattle. Even in broad daylight, even while engaged in visible labor, the predator had struck. This wasn't opportunistic. This was bold. This was someone confident in his ability to abduct, torture, and kill without facing consequences. The pattern was undeniable, yet authorities floundered. Initial theories fixated on the possibility of an organ trafficking ring. The precision of the castrations, the surgical nature of the mutilations. Surely this indicated medical knowledge, professional instruments, a commercial motive. Two doctors who'd recently relocated to Altamira found themselves detained for questioning. Anigio Ferreira de Souza and Cezio Brandeo. Suspicion fell on them not because of concrete evidence, but because they were newcomers, because they possessed medical expertise, because investigators desperately needed someone to blame for the incomprehensible. Expert analysis quickly determined that the organs, given how they'd been removed and the environmental conditions they'd been exposed to, were completely useless for transplantation purposes. This wasn't organ harvesting. This was something else entirely. Something darker, more personal, less rational. The doctors were released, though clouds of suspicion would follow them for years, eventually metastasizing into convictions that many believed were miscarriages of justice. As more bodies surfaced, some with eyes gouged out, some with additional dismemberments, some bearing evidence of prolonged torture before death, investigators pivoted to an even more disturbing theory. Perhaps this wasn't about organs or profit at all. Perhaps this was ritualistic. Perhaps a cult had taken root in Altamira, one that viewed these boys as sacrifices, their mutilations serving some occult purpose. The investigation began following leads into the superior universal lineage, a sect that mixed esotericism with apocalyptic theology, that had connections to Altamira, that believed children born after 1981 were somehow tainted or possessed. But even as prosecutors built cases against alleged cult members, even as the machinery of justice slowly ground toward convictions that would eventually result in decades-long prison sentences, another possibility lurked unexamined. What if the cult theory was wrong? What if the doctors were innocent scapegoats? What if, instead of a conspiracy of many, this was the work of one man? One solitary predator who'd perfected his technique over years of undetected killing, who moved through Altamira's streets unnoticed precisely because he seemed so ordinary, so unremarkable, so utterly human? That man existed. He had a name, a face, a history, and while authorities chased ritual conspiracies and medical professionals, he continued hunting. Tito Mendes Vieira had almost certainly been one of his victims, though it would take more than a decade for the connection to be made, for confessions to emerge, for the full scope of the horror to become visible. The monster wasn't hiding in shadows or conducting ceremonies by moonlight. He was walking in daylight, blending into the fabric of daily life, selecting his prey with the casualness of someone shopping for produce at a market. December 18, 2003. 12 years after Tito Mendes Vieira walked away from Tres Pontes and into oblivion, police in São Luís, Maranhão, arrested a 40-year-old mechanic named Francisco das Chagas Rodrigues de Brito. The arrest wasn't initially connected to the Altamira cases. Brito had been implicated in child murders in Maranhão state, where a fresh wave of emasculations had been terrorizing communities with the same methodical brutality that had plagued Altamira a decade earlier. But as investigators began interrogating Brito, as they subjected him to questioning that stretched across 40 hours in those first sessions and extended over months as details emerged incrementally, a much larger and more horrifying picture began to crystallize. Brito didn't maintain his innocence for long. There was something almost eager in the way he eventually began confessing, as though carrying these secrets had become burdensome, as though unburdening himself provided relief from some internal pressure that had been building for over a decade. On March 28, 2004, he admitted to murdering and emasculating 15 boys in Maranhão between 1991 and 2003. His descriptions were clinically detailed. Strangulation methods, stabbing techniques, the specific locations where he'd buried remains beneath the floor of his own home, in rural areas surrounding São Luís where nobody thought to look because why would a killer keep trophies so close? Forensic teams descended on the locations Brito identified. They found exactly what he described. Skeletal remains, children's bones, evidence of dismemberment and deliberate concealment. DNA analysis confirmed identities in 3 cases, definitively linking Brito to boys who'd been reported missing, whose families had spent years oscillating between hope and despair. The physical evidence was irrefutable. Francisco das Chagas Rodrigues de Brito wasn't just a killer. He was one of Brazil's most prolific serial killers, operating across 2 states, across more than a decade, accumulating a victim count that eventually reached into the 40s. But Maranhão wasn't the full story. During transport to Altamira in June 2004 for questioning about the earlier cases, Brito made additional admissions that sent shockwaves through investigators who'd thought the cult convictions had closed the chapter on those crimes. He confessed to 12 murders in Altamira between 1989 and 1993, the exact time frame when boys had been vanishing, when families had been filing desperate reports, when authorities had been chasing ritual conspiracy theories. Brito described luring vulnerable boys, always from poor families, always in that specific age range, to isolated locations in the forest surrounding the city. His method was consistent. Gain trust through simple offers, help with a task, mangoes, assistance retrieving something. Lead them away from witnesses, incapacitate them, and then unleash violence that combines sexual assault with methodical mutilation. He directed police to burial sites in forested areas near Altamira. Excavations began. Teams worked in oppressive heat and humidity, digging in soil that had composted human remains for over a decade, sifting through layers of earth and roots and decomposition. They found skeletal remains exhibiting castration wounds consistent with the unsolved disappearances of boys aged 10 to 14 from the early 1990s. The bones corroborated Brito's confessions in details that only the killer could have known. Locations, positioning, even the arrangement of markers he'd used to help him relocate graves when he wanted to revisit them. This is where Tito Mendes Vieira's case intersects most directly with Francisco das Chagas Rodrigues de Brito. In one of his confessions, Brito described killing a boy around 9 or 10 years old in 1992, whose body was found at the bridge over the Am Creek at Tres Pontes, the exact location where Tito had been swimming, where he was last seen with an unknown man, the coordinates of his final known moments on Earth. The timing was imperfect. Brito's confession placed the murder in 1992, while Tito disappeared in January 1991, but memories blur, especially memories of dozens of murders committed across years. The location, the method, the victim profile all aligned with devastating precision. Tito had been seen with an unknown man. Brito was that archetype made flesh, unremarkable enough to move through communities without triggering alarm, ordinary enough that parents wouldn't immediately pull their children away from him, practiced enough in the art of appearing harmless that even cautious individuals found reasons to trust him. He was a mechanic, someone who worked with his hands, someone people hired for legitimate services, someone integrated into the social fabric rather than obviously separate from it. The confession brought closure of a sort, though closure is perhaps the wrong word for families who'd spent over a decade not knowing whether to grieve or hope, not knowing whether their sons were dead or suffering somewhere beyond reach. Now they knew. The knowing didn't ease the pain. It transformed it, gave it sharp edges and concrete dimensions, turned abstract absence into the confirmed finality of murder. Tito's mother learned that her son had almost certainly been tortured, castrated, killed, and buried in unmarked graves somewhere in the forest that had been his backyard, his playground, his world. But the confession also opened uncomfortable questions about the cult convictions. If Brito had committed 12 murders in Altamira during the exact period when cult members were supposedly conducting ritualistic killings, if his modus operandi matched the crime scenes that had been attributed to the superior universal lineage, then what did that mean for the doctors and businessmen who'd been sentenced to decades in prison? Were they innocent? Had justice gotten it catastrophically wrong? Or had there been two separate phenomena occurring simultaneously? A lone serial killer and an organized cult both targeting the same demographic in the same town during the same years? The accused cult members maintained their innocence, demanding reinvestigation. Legal scholars debated the strength of the evidence that had convicted them, noting it had relied heavily on witness testimony that could have been coerced or confused, on circumstantial connections to the sect, on the kind of mass hysteria that swept through Altamira when no clear answers emerged and people desperately needed someone to blame. The conviction of Brito, backed by physical evidence and detailed confessions, cast doubt on everything that had come before. Brazilian law isn't structured to accommodate serial killers on Brito's scale. He received lengthy sentences, technically enough prison time to exceed a normal human lifespan, but the constitutional maximum someone can actually serve is 30 years, regardless of the number of victims. That means Francisco das Chagas Rodrigues de Brito, who confessed to murdering 42 children across 2 states over 14 years, who destroyed families and communities with methodical precision, who kept trophies of his victims including body parts stored in his residence, could theoretically be released, might already be approaching eligibility for release, could walk free again while his victims remain forever young, forever absent, forever just bones in the forest. How do you comprehend that? How does a legal system reconcile justice with the practical limitations of imprisonment? How do communities heal when the monster who shattered them might eventually return? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're the ongoing anguish of regions still processing trauma that occurred decades ago but feels immediate whenever Brito's name surfaces in news cycles. Whenever anniversary dates approach, whenever families visit graves or empty chairs at dinner tables. Brito himself offered explanations that provided no comfort. In interrogations, he claimed something was guiding him, directing him. Like a voice in my head, he told authorities, as though externalizing responsibility for his actions, as though some separate entity had hijacked his body and forced him to commit atrocities against his will. Sometimes I'm revolted by what I did, he said. But you must understand that something was using me to do this. Good people will understand that. It's the statement of someone seeking sympathy, seeking to be understood as victim rather than perpetrator, seeking to shift blame onto abstractions like voices or compulsions rather than accepting that he made choices, deliberate and repeated, to hunt children, to torture them, to steal their lives for whatever satisfaction he derived from their suffering. Good people don't understand that. They can't. The gap between normal human experience and whatever operated inside Francisco das Chagas Rodrigues de Brito is unbridgeable. We can study him, categorize him, imprison him, but understanding him in any meaningful sense requires a willingness to empathize with the fundamentally unempathizable, to find common ground with someone who viewed children as objects for use and disposal. 24 years have passed since Tito Mendes Vieira walked away from his family's home on that sweltering January afternoon in 1991. 20 years since Francisco das Chagas Rodrigues de Brito's arrest brought long-delayed answers to families who thought they might never know what happened to their sons. But time, despite the cliché, doesn't heal all wounds. Some wounds are too deep, too fundamental, too entangled with identity and meaning to ever fully close. The families of Altamira's vanished children carry scars that have become part of their permanent architecture, structures of grief that shape how they move through the world. Tito's mother never got to bury her son. No remains were definitively identified as his. No grave exists where she can lay flowers on anniversary dates or sit in the kind of contemplative sadness that sometimes passes for peace. Instead, she has absence, pure, unadulterated absence, and the knowledge that somewhere in the forest surrounding Altamira, reduced to scattered bones or dissolved entirely into the soil, lies what remains of the boy she carried for 9 months, nursed through childhood illnesses, watched grow into the edge of adolescence. That knowledge isn't closure. It's just a different form of torture. The survivors, Oatmeal, Waldeckley, and others whose names haven't been publicly released to protect their privacy, face different but equally devastating challenges. Physical reconstructions can repair damage to some extent, but they can't restore what was stolen. Psychological scars run deeper than any surgeon's knife can reach. These boys, now men in their late 30s and early 40s, have had to construct lives around trauma that occurred when they were still learning what it meant to be human. Trust becomes complicated when your first major experience with adult men outside your family involved betrayal of the most fundamental kind. Intimacy becomes fraught when your body was violated before you understood what intimacy even was. Identity becomes fractured when the thing done to you gets reduced to a single descriptor, victim or survivor, terms that flatten the totality of who you are into the worst thing that ever happened to you. Altamira itself carries the weight of what occurred within its boundaries. The municipality has grown in the decades since, population swelling past 110,000, development projects bringing new infrastructure and economic opportunities, the Trans-Amazonian Highway connecting it more thoroughly to the rest of Brazil. But growth doesn't erase history. The Igarapes still flow through the landscape. Três Pontes still exists as a geographical location where children sometimes swim on hot afternoons. Parents still worry when their kids are out of sight for too long, though the specific terror of the early 1990s has faded into more generalized anxiety about the dangers children face in any Brazilian city. Trafficking, gang violence, the quotidian cruelties of poverty that don't require serial killers to devastate families. The legal aftermath continues to generate controversy and confusion. The cult members convicted in 2003, including doctors Anísio Ferreira de Souza and Césio Brandão, remain imprisoned, serving sentences of 77 and 56 years respectively. But Francisco das Chagas Rodrigues de Brito's confession has transformed their cases into symbols of potential wrongful conviction. Advocacy groups argue that the convictions relied on flawed evidence, mass hysteria, and institutional pressure to blame someone, anyone, for crimes that traumatized an entire region. Others maintain that the cult explanation and the serial killer explanation aren't mutually exclusive, that perhaps both phenomena occurred simultaneously, that perhaps the truth is more complicated than simple either-or propositions allow. What's indisputable is that the Brazilian justice system, designed for a very different scale and type of criminality, struggled catastrophically to handle the Altamira cases. The initial investigations were undermined by limited resources, geographical isolation, institutional skepticism toward poor families reporting missing children, and the sheer unfamiliarity of serial homicide on this scale. Brazilian law enforcement in the early 1990s hadn't encountered many serial killers. The phenomenon was associated with wealthy, developed nations, not impoverished Amazonian municipalities. The framework for understanding, investigating, and prosecuting such crimes simply didn't exist in robust form. That began changing after Brito's arrest. His case, along with others like the Beast of the Andes and various high-profile Brazilian serial killers who emerged in public consciousness during the 2000s, forced legal and law enforcement communities to develop new protocols, new training, new approaches to predatory serial crime. The National Public Security Force, created in 2004, represented part of this evolution, federal resources that could be deployed to assist local investigations lacking expertise or capacity. But these changes came too late for Tito Mendes Vieira and the dozens of other children whose deaths might have been prevented if systems had been in place earlier. International attention eventually focused on the Altamira cases, particularly after victims' families and human rights organizations appealed to the Organization of American States, arguing that Brazil had failed to protect vulnerable children, failed to investigate disappearances with appropriate urgency, failed to prevent a serial killer from operating unchecked for over a decade across 2 states. The OAS issued recommendations about improving missing children protocols, enhancing forensic capabilities in remote regions, addressing the systemic poverty that makes certain populations particularly vulnerable to predation. Brazil implemented some of these recommendations. Others remain aspirational, hampered by limited budgets and the competing demands of a nation dealing with multiple crises simultaneously. The psychological toll on investigators deserves acknowledgement too. The detectives who worked the Altamira cases, who excavated graves containing children's bones, who interviewed traumatized survivors, who listened to Francisco das Chagas Rodriguez de Brito describe his crimes in meticulous detail, they carried that material home in ways that changed them permanently. Secondary trauma isn't as dramatic as primary trauma, but it's real, corrosive, cumulative. Several officers who worked the cases eventually sought therapy themselves, struggling with nightmares, hypervigilance, difficulty trusting others, the whole constellation of post-traumatic symptoms that emerges when you spend months or years immersed in evidence of human evil. Media coverage of the cases oscillated between exploitation and genuine investigation. Sensationalist outlets emphasized the most graphic details, turning murdered children into content for audiences hungry for true crime narratives. More responsible journalism attempted to highlight systemic failures, to advocate for the families who'd been dismissed and ignored, to pressure authorities into taking action when institutional inertia threatened to bury the cases under bureaucratic weight. The balance was difficult to maintain. How do you tell stories that need telling without commodifying tragedy, without reducing real human suffering to entertainment for strangers who'll forget the names as soon as the article ends? This script exists in that same tension. Tito Mendez Vieira deserves to be remembered, not as a statistic, not as a victim in a list of victims, but as a 13-year-old boy who loved swimming in igarapes and picking mangoes, who had a mother who fought futilely against police indifference to have his disappearance taken seriously, who represents every vulnerable child whom systems fail to protect. His story isn't just about one killer's depravity. It's about poverty, about institutional neglect, about the way certain lives are valued less than others based solely on the accident of where and to whom they're born. It's also about resilience, the stubborn persistence of families who refuse to let their children become forgotten, who continue demanding justice decades after the immediate crisis has faded from public attention. Tito's mother is likely still alive, now in her 60s or 70s, carrying the same unanswered questions she carried in 1991, the same grief that never quite settles into acceptance. The survivors continue constructing lives from the fragments they were left with, demonstrating that humans possess remarkable capacity for endurance even when endurance seems impossible. And it's about the monsters who walk among us. Not metaphorical monsters, not supernatural entities, but human beings who make incomprehensible choices repeatedly, who develop methodologies for inflicting suffering, who operate in plain sight because we're collectively unwilling to accept that evil doesn't announce itself with horns and a tail. Francisco das Chagas Rodriguez de Brito was someone's neighbor, someone's employee, someone you might have asked for help fixing a broken engine without ever suspecting that his hands had strangled children, mutilated their bodies, buried them in forests where tucum palms grew and streams ran clear. The Amazon rainforest continues its ancient cycles, indifferent to human tragedy. Trees grow over burial sites. Streams wash away blood and dissolve evidence. The forest that witnessed Tito's final moments holds those secrets in the same neutral way it holds everything else. No moral judgment, no preference for innocence over guilt, just the relentless biological processes that reduce all organic matter to component elements and redistribute them through soil and water and air. But we who remain, we who tell these stories and try to extract meaning from senseless violence, can't afford the luxury of indifference. We remember because remembering is the only defense we have against allowing history to repeat itself. We speak names like Tito Mendez Vieira because silence serves only those who benefit from obscurity. We demand better systems, better protections, better responses because children are still vulnerable, predators still hunt, and the failures that enabled Brito's decade-long killing spree weren't unique to Altamira in the 1990s. They're present wherever poverty intersects with institutional neglect, wherever certain lives are deemed less worthy of protection, wherever families lack the resources and social capital to force authorities to take their fears seriously. On January 20th, 1991, a 13-year-old boy walked toward a stream to escape the afternoon heat. He encountered someone who saw him not as a person but as an opportunity. And in that moment, countless futures collapsed. Not just Tito's unrealized life, but the lives of everyone who loved him, everyone who would have known him, everyone who carries the weight of his absence like a stone in their chest that never quite settles comfortably. That's the true horror of what happened in Altamira. It's not the graphic details of mutilation and murder, though those details haunt anyone who encounters them. It's not even the staggering body count, though 42 murdered children across 14 years represents catastrophic failure on multiple levels. The true horror is the ordinariness of how it happened. Vulnerable children in different systems, one methodical predator, and the mathematical certainty that somewhere, right now, similar dynamics are creating new victims whose names we don't yet know, whose families will soon begin the agonizing journey from worry to dread to devastating confirmation. Tito Mendez Vieira never got to grow up, never got to discover who he might have become, never got to make the choices that define adult life. His potential was stolen by someone who viewed him as disposable, as less than human, as merely the raw material for satisfying urges that Francisco das Chagas Rodriguez de Brito could have chosen every single time not to act upon. The stream at Tres Pontes still flows. Children still swim there on hot afternoons. Life continues because life always continues, even in places marked by atrocity. But the water holds memories now, encoded in the soil of its banks, present in the way parents instinctively tense when their children wade too deep or wander too far from sight. Tito's final swim became everyone's nightmare. His last walk with a stranger became the cautionary tale mothers whisper to their sons. And somewhere in the Amazon rainforest, beneath the canopy that filters equatorial sunlight into dappled green shade, beneath the soil that feeds massive trees and supports ecosystems of staggering complexity, lies what remains of a boy who loved mangoes and swimming, who trusted the wrong person on the wrong afternoon, who became a statistic in Brazil's most horrifying serial killer case. His name was Tito Mendez Vieira. He was 13 years old. He mattered. He matters. He will continue to matter as long as anyone remembers to speak his name, to tell his story, to insist that his abbreviated life and stolen future represent an injustice that demands acknowledgement, demands better, demands we never become so numb to horror that we accept it as inevitable rather than fighting with everything we have to prevent it from happening again. The monster hunted. The children vanished. The families grieved. The systems failed. The forest kept its secrets. And one afternoon in January 1991, a boy named Tito walked into the shadows and never walked back into the light. That's the story. That's the tragedy. That's what we must never forget. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you never miss the next true crime story to help you unwind. Now, let's get into our final story. Story 4. The Vanishing. The Disappearance of Thomas Dean Gibson. The last sound 2-year-old Thomas Dean Gibson ever made was the soft patter of his checkered tennis shoes on wooden porch boards, a whisper that dissolved into the morning fog of rural Oregon before anyone could understand what it meant. March 18, 1991, 11:30 a.m. Azalea, Oregon. The morning carried the scent of pine and damp earth, a smell that would forever haunt those who searched the woods that day. Tommy Gibson, as his family called him, had been playing in the front yard of the family's rural property, his brown eyes tracking the movements of birds in the trees overhead. He wore those checkered shoes, a small gap visible between his front teeth when he smiled. At 2 years and 8 months old, he barely reached his father's knee. Larry Gibson, a deputy sheriff with Douglas County, emerged from the house that morning carrying his .45 caliber pistol in a shoulder holster. The weapon wasn't for protection from people. For weeks, stray cats had been prowling the property, multiplying faster than the local humane society could handle them. Larry had taken to carrying the gun during his daily jogs, dispatching the animals when he saw them. It was a practice that would later seem prophetic in its violence. According to Larry's account, Tommy was playing contentedly in the yard when he told the boy to stay put and wait for his 4-year-old sister, Karen, to come outside. Then Larry set off on his routine 2-mile jog through the wooded paths that surrounded their isolated home. What happened next would be replayed, dissected, and questioned for decades. As Larry hopped the fence at the edge of the property, he spotted one of the feral cats near where Tommy played. He raised the pistol, 'fired, 'and watched the cat bolt down the hill. Inside the house, Larry heard the cat scream, "Tommy! Tommy!" His heart raced. He ran, his blood boiling. He ran, his heart racing. He ran, his blood boiling. 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 He ran, his blo His wife Judith heard the sharp crack of the gunshot pierce the morning quiet. She listened for Tommy's voice afterward and heard it. She would later tell police, still playing on the porch. Larry continued his jog. By his estimation, he was gone 47 minutes. When he returned, dripping with sweat from the humid Oregon morning, Judith met him with words that would shatter their world. She couldn't find Tommy. The first minutes of a missing child case are chaos distilled into human form. Judith, Larry, and his brother scoured the property, calling Tommy's name into the dense forest that pressed against their home from all sides. The woods swallowed their voices. They checked the creek beds, the outbuildings, the vehicles. Nothing. No small body, no torn clothing, no sign of struggle. Tommy had simply ceased to exist. Within an hour, the Douglas County Sheriff's Office descended on the Gibson property. Deputies, volunteers, and neighbors arrived in waves, their vehicles kicking up dust on the dirt road. Search dogs strained at their leashes, nose to the ground, tracking scents that led nowhere. The woods that had seemed peaceful that morning now felt malevolent. Every shadow a potential hiding place. Every rustle of leaves a cruel promise of discovery that never came. Larry Gibson's behavior during those first hours struck investigators as odd. Instead of immediately joining the search, he went inside to shower and change into his deputy's uniform. When questioned about this later, he explained that he wanted to be prepared, to look professional. But to the investigators watching him, it seemed like a man cleaning up a crime scene. During the initial search, Larry left the property for approximately 25 minutes. He told investigators he wanted to check a nearby rest area, that his daughter Karen had mentioned seeing a couple in a truck. When he returned, his patrol car's odometer showed 7 miles that couldn't be accounted for. 7 miles. In a case where every minute mattered, where had those miles taken him? Karen Gibson, at 4 years old, became a key witness in those first hours. Frightened and confused by the chaos around her, she told investigators that she had seen a man and woman pull into their driveway in an older model truck, gold or tan in color. The woman had long blonde hair, the man dark hair and a beard. They wore scruffy clothing. The license plate, Karen said, was in the wrong place, visible in the back window rather than mounted properly on the vehicle. But when investigators first interviewed Karen that day, she hadn't mentioned any abduction. The story came later, filtered through her father's telling. This discrepancy lodged in the investigators' minds like a splinter. By nightfall of that first day, over 200 searchers had combed through miles of wilderness. They used thermal imaging equipment that picked up heat signatures of raccoons, deer, and other nocturnal creatures, but never the small, warm body they desperately sought. Helicopters equipped with infrared cameras swept overhead, their rotors beating the air like the wings of enormous mechanical birds. The sound echoed through the valleys, a rhythm of hope and dread. The first 24 hours revealed several troubling details. Investigators found a dead cat on the lawn near where Tommy had been playing. Larry had said he missed his shot, but here was evidence that his bullet had found a target. The investigators began to construct a theory. What if the bullet had passed through the cat and struck Tommy? What if, in the space between that gunshot and Larry's return from his jog, something terrible had happened? Larry's clothing told another story that bothered investigators. Despite claiming to have jogged through wooded terrain still wet from recent rains, his running clothes were remarkably clean. Mud puddles dotted the path he said he'd taken, yet his shoes and pants showed no signs of the journey. The inconsistency was small, almost invisible, but in a case built on fragments, it glowed like a warning light. The timing didn't align either. Larry claimed his jog took 47 minutes, but investigators who retraced his route found the math didn't work. There were 20 unaccounted minutes, a gap in time where anything could have happened. In missing persons cases, investigators know that minutes matter. 20 minutes was an eternity. As the sun set on March 18, 1991, Tommy Gibson had been missing for approximately 8 hours. The critical window was closing. Every law enforcement officer on scene knew the grim statistics. If a child isn't found within the first few hours, the chances of recovery diminish exponentially. After 24 hours, hope begins its slow death. But Tommy's family clung to the abduction theory. A neighbor came forward 2 weeks later, suddenly remembering that she'd seen a gold or tan truck with 2 occupants on the day Tommy disappeared. She'd been driving to the bank when she noticed the vehicle because the license plate was visible through the back window, an unusual detail that stuck in her memory. She claimed to have seen it turn into the driveway leading to the Gibson home. The problem? She hadn't mentioned it during her initial interview. Like Karen's story, this account emerged only after time had passed, after memories could be shaped by suggestion and fear. As the first 48 hours drew to a close, the search intensified. Over 200 volunteers formed grid patterns, walking shoulder to shoulder through the forest, their eyes scanning every depression in the ground, every cluster of brush. They called Tommy's name until their voices grew hoarse. The sound of his name, repeated thousands of times, became a prayer, a plea, a demand that the forest give back what it had taken. Search and rescue dogs, trained to detect human remains, showed interest in several areas but never gave their trained alert that indicates a body. It meant Tommy had been there, his scent lingering like a ghost, but he wasn't there now, or he had never been there at all. Larry Gibson's patrol car, parked in the driveway during those crucial first hours, wasn't searched immediately. It was a decision that would haunt the investigation. By the time investigators thought to examine it weeks later, any evidence it might have contained had long since been contaminated or destroyed. The first 48 hours in any missing persons case are the difference between life and death, between resolution and eternal mystery. For Tommy Gibson, those hours passed in a blur of search helicopters, bloodhounds, and desperate prayers. When they ended, the child was no closer to being found than he had been when Judith Gibson first realized he was missing. But something else had solidified in those 2 days. Suspicion. It wrapped around Larry Gibson like morning fog, cold and inescapable. The search for Tommy Gibson stretched into 3 days of exhaustive effort that yielded nothing but exhaustion and heartbreak. Every accessible inch of forest within a 5-mile radius had been combed, every abandoned structure investigated, every waterway dragged. The boy had vanished as completely as if he'd never existed. By the end of the 3rd day, the volunteer searchers began to drift away, back to their jobs and families, carrying with them the weight of failure. The official search wound down, but the investigation was just beginning to reveal its darker contours. 6 weeks after Tommy's disappearance, the Oregon State Police filed a 31-page affidavit that named Larry Gibson as the prime suspect in his own son's disappearance. The document laid out a theory that would dominate the case for years. Larry had accidentally shot Tommy while aiming at the cat. Panicking about the implications for his career as a law enforcement officer, he had hidden the body before anyone could discover what had happened. The theory explained many of the inconsistencies: the shower, the clean clothes, the missing 20 minutes, the 7 unaccounted miles on his patrol car. It all fit together with a terrible, perfect logic. But theories aren't proof, and without Tommy's body, the case remained frozen in limbo. Investigators interviewed Larry repeatedly, applying gentle pressure, then more force. During one interrogation, when confronted with the theory that he'd accidentally shot Tommy, Larry responded with words that would echo through the courtroom years later. It's possible. Not a denial. Not outrage at the accusation. Just those 2 words, hanging in the air like an admission. Larry maintained that he'd passed a polygraph examination. Polygraphs, however, measure physiological responses to stress, not truth. They're tools, not oracles. The fact that he'd passed told investigators little about his actual innocence or guilt. The case began to corrode the Gibson family from within. In January 1992, 10 months after Tommy vanished, Larry resigned from his position as deputy sheriff. The family moved to Montana, Larry's home state, where they attempted to rebuild a life shattered by loss and suspicion. Judith gave birth to another daughter, Lisa, in 1992. They tried to appear normal, to function as a family unit, but the investigation followed them like a shadow. Tommy's case was featured twice on the television program Unsolved Mysteries, hosted by Robert Stack. Millions of viewers saw the little boy's face, those brown eyes, that gap-toothed smile frozen in time. His image also appeared in the music video for Soul Asylum's hit song Runaway Train, a montage of missing children that aired on MTV in 1993. Tommy was the youngest child featured in the video. The publicity generated tips, hundreds of them, but none led anywhere. Anonymous callers claimed to have seen Tommy in shopping malls, at truck stops, in the arms of strangers. Each tip had to be investigated, each lead followed until it dead-ended in disappointment. The noise of false hope can be as devastating as silence. In Montana, the Gibson marriage began to fracture. The stress of living under investigation, combined with grief and the weight of unspoken accusations, proved too much. In 1993, Judith and Larry separated. Judith took the children and returned to Oregon, while Larry remained in Montana, working as an insurance agent in Townsend. The physical distance between them allowed something else to emerge, the truth, or at least a version of it. In March 1994, 3 years after Tommy disappeared, Karen Gibson, now 7 years old, told investigators a different story. Away from her father's presence, living with her mother back in Oregon, the memories that had been locked away by fear finally surfaced. Karen said she had watched from her bedroom window as her father beat Tommy. She described the scene in detail, Larry striking the little boy repeatedly until Tommy went limp. She saw her father disappear and then return carrying something in a large white garbage bag. The bag contained something small and black. Larry placed it in the trunk of his patrol car and drove away. When Larry returned, Karen said he told her what to say. He told her to describe the couple in the truck, to say they'd taken Tommy. She was 4 years old, terrified of her father, and she obeyed. She hid in her bedroom closet, shaking, understanding on some primal level that she had witnessed something terrible, something that could never be undone. Why had Karen remained silent for 3 years? The answer was as simple as it was heartbreaking. She was afraid her father would go to jail. More than that, she was afraid he would do to her what he had done to Tommy. Children understand violence in ways that adults often miss. They know that a person capable of hurting one child can hurt another. During the investigation, more details emerged about life inside the Gibson household. Judith testified that Larry had a pattern of abusing both children. The abuse wasn't constant, she said, but it was there, lurking beneath the surface of normal family life. Larry was under stress, she explained. She was taking college classes, spreading herself thin, and Larry bore the burden of childcare more than he wanted to. Investigators also learned about another piece of evidence, a phone call. Larry's half-sister, Debbie Kalek, would later testify that shortly after Tommy's disappearance, Larry had called her in a state of panic. On that call, she said he confessed to killing Tommy. He told her he might need money for bail. Debbie also recalled a chilling moment when Karen and Judith stayed with her in Iowa after the disappearance. Karen, still processing the trauma, made a comment about being afraid of her father, putting her in a big hole, like he had done to Tommy. The words were those of a child trying to make sense of horror, but they pointed toward a grim possibility. Tommy had been buried somewhere in the vast Oregon wilderness. Investigators theorized that Larry had used those missing 20 minutes, and perhaps the time when volunteers first began arriving to search, to dispose of Tommy's body. They believed he might have taken the child to an area known as Swamp Creek, a remote location where a small body could be hidden beneath layers of mud and vegetation. Searches of the area found nothing, but the terrain was treacherous, the kind of place that could keep secrets forever. On April 14, 1994, Montana authorities arrested Larry Gibson at his grandmother's home in Townsend. He was charged with second-degree murder in connection with Tommy's death. The arrest came more than 3 years after his son had vanished, a testament to how long it had taken to build a case without a body, without forensic evidence, without anything but witness testimony and circumstantial evidence. Larry waived extradition and was transported back to Oregon to face trial. In Montana, he left behind his life as an insurance agent, his grandmother, and the pretense of normalcy he'd constructed. Back in Oregon, he faced the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison. The prosecution's case rested heavily on Karen's testimony. She was now 7 years old, 3 years removed from the events she described. Defense attorneys would argue that her memories had been corrupted, that she'd been coached, that the story she told was the product of suggestion rather than genuine recollection. But prosecutors believed her. They believed that a 4-year-old child, hiding in her closet, had witnessed her brother's murder. The investigation had transformed from a missing persons case into a homicide case, but the central question remained unanswered. Where was Tommy Gibson? The trial of Larry Gibson began on January 18, 1995, in a Douglas County courtroom packed with spectators, media, and the ghosts of questions that had haunted the case for nearly 4 years. The prosecution faced an almost impossible task: convince a jury that Larry Gibson had killed his son without producing a body, without a murder weapon tied to the crime, without any physical evidence that a murder had even occurred. The state's case rested on 3 pillars: Karen Gibson's testimony, Larry's suspicious behavior, and the testimony of Debbie Kalek, his half-sister who claimed he'd confessed to the killing. Karen took the stand, now 7 years old, wearing a dress that made her look even younger than she was. She recounted what she'd seen from her bedroom window that March morning in 1991. Her father, she said, had beaten Tommy on the front porch. She described hearing his shoes on the wood, seeing him return with a garbage bag. The details were specific, vivid, the kind of details that are hard to fabricate. Defense attorneys attacked her credibility with the delicacy required when cross-examining a child, but their implications were clear. Karen's memory had been tainted by 3 years of separation from her father, by her mother's influence, by the suggestions of investigators who believed Larry was guilty. They pointed out that her original story, about the couple in the truck, had been consistent until after her parents separated. Only then had this new narrative emerged. The defense argued that Karen had been afraid to contradict her father's story while living with him, that the fear of his anger had kept her silent. When that fear was removed, when she was safely away from him, the truth finally surfaced. Debbie Kalek's testimony provided another damning piece of the puzzle. She described receiving that frantic phone call from Larry shortly after Tommy's disappearance. On that call, she testified, Larry had admitted to killing his son. He'd asked if she could help him with bail money, suggesting he knew arrest was inevitable. The defense challenged her recollection too, questioning why she hadn't immediately reported this confession to police. If her brother-in-law had truly admitted to murdering a child, wouldn't she have felt obligated to come forward? Her delay in reporting, they argued, suggested the conversation had been misremembered or misinterpreted. Debbie also testified about Karen's comment regarding being put in a big hole like Tommy. The words carried weight, suggesting that Karen knew, or believed she knew, what had happened to her brother's body. But they were the words of a traumatized child, filtered through time and the unreliable lens of memory. The prosecution called investigators who testified about the inconsistencies in Larry's account. The timeline that didn't align, the clean clothes, the missing 20 minutes, the 7 unexplained miles on his patrol car's odometer. Each inconsistency alone might be explainable, but together they formed a pattern that pointed toward guilt. Expert witnesses discussed the trajectory of bullets, the likelihood that Larry's shot could have passed through the cat and struck Tommy. They talked about the psychology of cover-ups, about how parents who accidentally kill their children sometimes hide the bodies out of panic and shame rather than seeking help. But the most powerful moment of the prosecution's case came when Judith Gibson took the stand. She testified about the pattern of abuse in their home, about Larry's temper, about the pressure he felt caring for the children while she pursued her education. She described a man who used physical discipline more freely than she was comfortable with, a man who sometimes crossed the line from punishment to abuse. Judith's testimony painted a picture of a household under stress, a father who might snap under the wrong circumstances. She confirmed that she'd heard the gunshot that morning, that she'd continued to hear Tommy playing afterward. But she also admitted she hadn't actually seen Tommy after Larry left for his jog. She'd heard sounds she interpreted as Tommy playing, but she hadn't verified his presence. The defense presented a different narrative. They argued that Tommy had been abducted, just as Karen had originally said. They pointed to the neighbor's testimony about seeing the tan or gold truck with the displaced license plate. They suggested that Karen's changed story was the result of coaching by her mother and investigators who were determined to pin the crime on Larry. Larry took the stand in his own defense, a calculated risk in any criminal trial. He denied abusing his children, though he admitted to light discipline, including once slapping Karen in the face and spanking her harder than he should have. He recounted the events of March 18, 1991, in detail. Tommy had been playing in the yard, Larry said. As he prepared to leave for his jog, Tommy called out to him, "Goodbye, Daddy. I love you." Larry waved back, telling his son he loved him too. Those were the last words they exchanged, the last moment of normalcy before Tommy disappeared into whatever darkness had claimed him. Larry described seeing the cat, firing the shot, continuing his jog. When he returned, his son was gone. He maintained that he had done everything he could to find Tommy, that his behavior during the search had been that of a desperate father, not a guilty man trying to cover his tracks. The defense hammered on the lack of physical evidence. No body, no blood, no forensic evidence linking Larry to a crime. They emphasized that Larry had passed a polygraph examination. They argued that the entire case was built on speculation, on the testimony of a traumatized child whose memories couldn't be trusted, and on a half-sister who had her own reasons to be unreliable. But as the trial progressed, another piece of testimony emerged that damaged Larry's defense. Prosecutors introduced evidence of abuse directed at his youngest daughter, Lisa, who had been born after Tommy's disappearance. The pattern of behavior suggested that Larry's violence wasn't an isolated incident, but a recurring problem. The jury deliberated for days, weighing testimony that pointed in opposite directions. They had to decide whether a child's testimony, changed 3 years after the fact, could be trusted. They had to consider whether Larry's behavior was that of a guilty man or a father operating under impossible circumstances. They had to determine, without a body, without physical evidence, whether they believed beyond a reasonable doubt that Larry Gibson had killed his son. In late February 1995, the jury reached a verdict. They found Larry Gibson guilty, not of murder, but of second-degree manslaughter. The distinction was significant. Manslaughter suggested the death was reckless or accidental, not premeditated. The jury had concluded that Tommy was dead and that Larry was responsible, but they couldn't determine that he'd intended to kill his son. The conviction allowed for a sentence of 15 to 18 months. Larry had already served 12 months in custody while awaiting trial. The judge sentenced him accordingly, meaning his remaining time would be minimal. Throughout the trial and after the verdict, Larry maintained his innocence. He proclaimed it from the witness stand, in interviews, in statements to the media. He insisted that someone had taken Tommy, that the real perpetrators remained free while he was being punished for a crime he didn't commit. The verdict satisfied no one. For those who believed Larry was guilty, the manslaughter conviction and short sentence seemed inadequate. For those who believed in his innocence, any conviction was a miscarriage of justice. And for Tommy's family, the verdict brought no closure, only the confirmation that their little boy was gone and was likely never coming home. Larry Gibson was released from prison in September 1996, having served less than 2 years for the death of his son. He walked out of the Oregon State Penitentiary into a life that had been irrevocably altered by tragedy and conviction. The world he re-entered viewed him through the lens of the trial as a man who had killed his own child, whether intentionally or through terrible accident. Oregon officials made a decision that many found controversial. They closed Tommy's case. They were no longer looking for him. In the eyes of the state, the case was resolved. Tommy was dead, his father had been convicted, and no further investigation was warranted. The declaration brought finality to a case that had consumed resources and attention for years, but it also meant that any hope of finding Tommy's body was officially abandoned. Larry returned to Montana, where he attempted to rebuild his life. He worked various jobs, trying to stay beneath the radar of public attention that his conviction had brought. In 2001, 10 years after Tommy's disappearance, Larry did something that shocked many. He created a website dedicated to finding his son. The website maintained his innocence and asked the public for information about Tommy's whereabouts. It presented the case from Larry's perspective, arguing that his son had been abducted and was possibly still alive. The site included Tommy's photograph, details about his appearance, and a plea for anyone with information to come forward. To those who believed in Larry's guilt, the website seemed like a cruel continuation of the lies he'd told since Tommy's disappearance. To those who believed he might be innocent, it represented the actions of a father who had never stopped searching for his lost child. The truth, as always in this case, remained elusive. Larry also pursued a career as a country music singer in Montana, performing at local venues and writing songs that sometimes touched on themes of loss and injustice. Music, perhaps, provided an outlet for emotions that had no other acceptable expression. On stage, he was just another performer, not the man convicted of killing his son. For the Gibson family, the aftermath of the trial was equally complex. Judith raised her remaining children, carrying the weight of knowing what had happened, or believing she knew. Karen grew up with the memory of that morning, whether accurate or distorted, etched into her consciousness. The family's story became one of survival in the face of unimaginable loss. Tommy's case remained in the public consciousness, kept alive by true crime enthusiasts who dissected every detail of the investigation and trial. Online forums debated the evidence, with some arguing that Larry was guilty beyond any doubt and others suggesting reasonable alternatives. The case appeared in true crime documentaries, podcasts, and articles, each retelling adding new layers of interpretation to the facts. The investigation's handling became a case study in law enforcement training. The delayed search of Larry's patrol car, the initial acceptance of Karen's abduction story, the challenges of building a case without a body, all became lessons for future investigators facing similar circumstances. Tommy's image, frozen in time as a 2-year-old with brown eyes and a gap-toothed smile, continued to circulate. He was the youngest child featured in the Runaway Train music video, and though many of the children shown in that video were eventually found, Tommy never was. His face became a symbol of cases that resist resolution, children who vanish and leave behind only questions. Investigators who worked the case never forgot it. For some, it was the one that got away, the case they couldn't solve to their satisfaction. Without Tommy's body, without definitive proof of what happened that March morning, they were left with a conviction that felt incomplete. They believed Larry was responsible, but belief and certainty are different things. The passage of time has done little to settle the questions surrounding Tommy's disappearance. If anything, the years have added complexity, as memories fade and the principles in the case age or pass away. The Oregon wilderness that might hold Tommy's remains has been searched repeatedly, but the terrain is vast and unforgiving. Swamp Creek, where investigators believe Larry might have disposed of the body, could conceal secrets indefinitely. As of 2025, Thomas Dean Gibson has been missing for over 34 years. He would be in his 30s now if he were alive, a man with a life, perhaps a family of his own. But the evidence suggests he never grew past that 2-year-old playing in his front yard. His whole future compressed into a moment of violence or tragedy that ended before he could understand what was happening. The case raises questions that extend beyond the specifics of Tommy's disappearance. It speaks to the nature of truth and memory, particularly as filtered through the mind of a child. It illuminates the challenges of prosecuting crimes without physical evidence. It demonstrates how family dynamics, stress, and violence can intersect with devastating consequences. For investigators and true crime enthusiasts, the case remains a puzzle with missing pieces. Was Larry guilty of accidentally shooting Tommy and then covering it up? Did he beat the child in a rage and hide the body? Or was Tommy actually abducted by strangers who were never identified or caught? Each theory has proponents, each explanation gaps that can't be filled. The initial response to Tommy's disappearance, particularly those critical first 48 hours, reveals how crucial rapid, thorough investigation is in missing persons cases. The delays, the assumptions, the initial acceptance of Larry's account, all contributed to a case that became exponentially harder to solve with each passing hour. If Tommy was killed that morning, as the jury concluded, then those first hours were when his body could have been recovered, when evidence was fresh, when the truth was still discoverable. By the time investigators fully shifted their focus to Larry as a suspect, 6 weeks had passed. 6 weeks for evidence to degrade, for stories to solidify, for a body to be hidden so thoroughly it might never be found. The case also highlights the vulnerability of children in their own homes. If the prosecution's theory is correct, Tommy died at the hands of someone who should have protected him. The tragedy compounds when considering that Karen witnessed it, that she carried that knowledge for 3 years while living with the person she believed had killed her brother. Larry Gibson's continued insistence on his innocence adds another layer of complexity. He has maintained, for over 3 decades, that he did not harm his son. Either he is telling the truth, making him a man who was wrongfully convicted and lost everything, or he is committed to a lie that he can never abandon without destroying whatever life he has managed to build. The psychological toll on everyone involved is immeasurable. For Judith, the loss of a son compounded by the betrayal, if the allegations are true, of her husband. For Karen, growing up with traumatic memories and the burden of having testified against her father. For Larry, if innocent, the nightmare of being blamed for a crime he didn't commit. For Larry, if guilty, the weight of living with what he did. Tommy's case remains officially unsolved in the sense that his body has never been recovered. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children still lists him as missing. Age progression images show what he might look like as an adult, though few believe he survived past that March morning in 1991. The forest around the Gibson property in Azalea, Oregon, still stands, largely unchanged from that day in 1991. Hikers occasionally pass through, unaware that they might be walking near where a little boy's body was hidden decades ago. The trees keep their secrets. The earth holds whatever truth it was given. For those who remember Tommy, who saw his picture on Unsolved Mysteries or in the runaway train video, his case represents something larger than one missing child. It embodies the fear that children can disappear, that even in their own yards with family nearby, they are vulnerable. It reminds us that closure is not guaranteed, that some questions remain unanswered no matter how thoroughly we search. Thomas Dean Gibson was 2 years, 8 months old when he vanished. He liked to play outside. He had brown hair and brown eyes. He wore checkered tennis shoes. These details, repeated in missing persons reports and news articles for over 3 decades, are all that remain of a life that barely began before it ended. The last sound he made, or that anyone acknowledged hearing, was his voice calling out to his father, telling him goodbye, telling him he loved him. If those were indeed his last words, they carry a tragic irony. A child expressing love to the person who, according to a jury of his peers, was responsible for ending his life. The case of Thomas Dean Gibson remains a haunting reminder of how quickly a normal morning can transform into tragedy, how completely a child can vanish, and how justice, even when technically served, can feel incomplete without the answer to the only question that truly matters. Where is Tommy? That question echoes still, 3 decades later, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. Tommy Gibson exists now only in photographs, in memories, in the minds of those who wonder what happened on that Oregon morning when a little boy ceased to be. The forest keeps its secrets. The earth remembers. But Tommy Gibson remains, in the most fundamental sense, missing. Thank you for watching and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.